Hey friends! Glad you're here at Vision Harry. We've cooked up something special. The Sorting Hat refused to continue until Dumbledore explained Harry's 40 tracking curses. Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, The Hat Speaks. The train ride had taken 7 hours, and Harry had spent most of them watching. Not obviously. He'd learned a long time ago that obvious watching got you noticed, and getting noticed at the Dursleys meant getting hit, so he'd developed a way of looking at things from the corner of his attention, registering faces, postures, the small physical tells that people gave off when they thought nobody was paying attention. The girl with the bushy brown hair 3 compartments down had knocked on his door twice, once to ask about the toad that a round-faced boy had lost, and once, an hour later, with what Harry suspected was a different excuse because she'd already found the toad by then. She wanted to look at him. He didn't mind. He was looking at everyone. The red-haired boy who'd sat with him for the first half of the journey had talked almost continuously, which Harry had found more useful than intrusive because people who talked a lot told you things they didn't mean to. Ron Weasley had 4 older brothers already at Hogwarts, a family with more warmth and money, a mother who packed good sandwiches, and a complicated mixture of awe and resentment toward Harry Potter that Ron hadn't yet figured out how to manage. Harry had eaten the sandwiches Ron offered. The Dursleys had fed him before the journey, which was unusual enough that he'd considered the possibility of poison before deciding Vernon was more likely just afraid of drawing attention to himself at King's Cross, and he'd answered Ron's questions carefully, giving true answers that contained very little actual information, which was a skill he'd been practicing since he was 6. By the time the train pulled into Hogsmeade Station, Harry knew the names of 11 other first years, the approximate family politics of 4 of them, and the fact that someone had placed a mild observation charm on the luggage rack above his seat somewhere around Birmingham. He'd left it alone. Whoever was watching already knew where he was going, and disrupting their surveillance would only tell them he'd found it. This was the thing people didn't understand about being watched: the moment you let them know you knew, you lost more than you gained. The boats were cold and the lake was enormous and dark in the way that suggested depth rather than danger, and Harry sat at the back of his boat and looked up at the castle for the first time. He'd imagined it plenty of times, working from descriptions in the books he'd read and the occasional slip that Aunt Petunia made when she was tired and forgot to be careful. She'd seen it once, apparently, and never fully recovered from the experience, but the imagination was a smaller instrument than the reality. Hogwarts was less like a building and more like a decision that stone had made a very long time ago. It sat on its hill the way mountains sat on the earth, which was to say completely without apology. He felt something in his chest that he hadn't been expecting. Not awe, exactly. More like recognition. The giant man who'd come to fetch him from the Dursleys, Hagrid, Rubeus Hagrid, who had cried when he delivered the news about Harry's parents and clearly expected Harry to cry too and had been gently baffled when Harry hadn't, was leading the boats across the lake with the air of someone performing a beloved annual ritual, and Harry could see the genuine affection in the way he watched the first years react to the castle. He filed that away too. Hagrid was trustworthy in the specific way of people who were entirely transparent. You could see everything he felt the moment he felt it, which made him either very safe or very dangerous depending on the situation. The castle swallowed them. There was a stone entrance hall large enough to contain the Dursleys' entire street, lit by torches that burned in brackets along the walls and by the ambient magic that Harry could feel pressing gently against his skin like a change in air pressure. He'd read about that too. Hogwarts was one of the most magically dense locations in Britain, 1,000 years of spellwork layered over itself until the castle was less a structure and more a living argument. He could feel why. The magic here had texture. It had opinion. Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall, and Harry revised several of his initial assessments about Hogwarts in the first 30 seconds of watching her speak. She was precise in the way of people who had made peace with exactness, whose relationship with the truth was direct and unadorned and better for it. When she said you will be sorted into your houses, she meant it as information, not ceremony, and the distinction was visible in every line of her posture. She also looked, Harry noticed, at him for 2 seconds longer than she looked at anyone else, and then looked away with the deliberate care of someone who had decided not to do something they very much wanted to do. He wondered, not for the first time, what she knew. The ghost, nearly headless Nick, nearly decapitated in the 16th century, still evidently sore about the nearly part, swept through the entrance hall and gave Harry a bow that contained more genuine warmth than most of the handshakes he'd received that day, and the first years laughed and chattered and straightened their robes, and Harry straightened his too and watched the double doors at the end of the hall and waited. The great hall was firelight and sky, thousands of candles drifting overhead and the ceiling charmed to show the night beyond, and Harry had exactly 3 seconds to take it in before he registered the tables, the students, the faculty at the high table, and then the specific individual at the center of the high table who was watching him with the mild, luminous attention of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a decade. Albus Dumbledore. Harry had read about him too, obviously. He'd also dreamed about him, which was more interesting and less predictable. In the dreams Dumbledore was always turning away, always mid-sentence, always in the act of explaining something that Harry couldn't quite catch. He'd assumed the dreams were his own subconscious working through his feelings about the man who'd placed him with the Dursleys. But standing in the great hall for the first time with the old man's blue eyes resting on him from across the room, Harry felt the small, cold certainty that the dreams were something else. He held Dumbledore's gaze for a moment. Then he looked away first, because it cost him nothing to let someone think they'd won a staring contest, and he filed away the complicated flash of something, relief? Something that wanted to be love. That had moved across Dumbledore's face in that moment. McGonagall brought out the stool. She set the hat on it. The hat was worse than Harry had expected and better, simultaneously, worse because it looked genuinely ancient in a way that suggested not age but accumulation, as though it had been absorbing information for so long that the information had started to show in the fabric, better because he could feel it from 10 feet away, a deep, resonant magical presence that was nothing like the tracking curses he'd been carrying since before he could remember. Yes. He knew about those too. He'd been 7 when he first felt them. Not consciously, at 7 he hadn't had the vocabulary for it, hadn't known that what he was sensing was magic at all, only that there was something stuck to him the way a shadow was stuck to a person, except it wasn't his. By the time he was 9 he'd found a copy of most Patendi curses shoved behind a radiator in the back of a junk shop in Little Whinging, and by the time he was 10 he'd confirmed what he'd suspected. Someone had layered tracking enchantments into his magical signature so thoroughly that separating them from his natural magic was like trying to pull threads from woven cloth without disturbing the pattern. He'd counted them. 40. He'd counted them 40 times and gotten 40 both times, which meant the number was reliable. He didn't know who'd placed them. He had theories. He'd had theories since he was 9, which was perhaps not a normal thing for a 9-year-old to have, but then again, very little about his life was normal. The hat began its song, and Harry listened, and the song was old and strange and funny in places and wise in others, and the first years around him clapped when it finished and Harry clapped too, a moment behind, because he'd been spending the duration of the song paying attention to the hat's magic rather than its words. The magic was extraordinary. It moved like water finding its level, seeking out the shape of whatever it was next to, patient and ancient and, he was almost certain, genuinely curious. It was the most alive piece of magic he'd ever felt. McGonagall unrolled her scroll and began calling names. Abbott, Hannah. Hufflepuff. Bones, Susan. Hufflepuff. Boot, Terry. Ravenclaw. Brocklehurst, Mandy. Ravenclaw. The girl with the bushy hair, Granger, Hermione, sat under the hat for 30 seconds before it sent her to Gryffindor with what felt, even from across the hall, like genuine enthusiasm, and she walked to the Gryffindor table with her back very straight and her face working through a series of emotions too fast to catch. Longbottom, Neville fell off the stool on his way to sit down and caught himself, and the hat sorted him to Gryffindor with what seemed like immediate decisiveness, and Neville walked to the table with the dazed expression of someone who had expected the worst and received something better and not yet processed the gap. Malfoy, Draco didn't even wait for the hat to touch his head. Slytherin, it said, and it sounded less like a judgment than an administrative formality, and Draco strode to the Slytherin table with his chin up and the specific posture of someone who had been practicing this moment in front of a mirror. Patil. Perks. Potter, Harry." The great hall went still in the particular way that halls go still when 1,000 people simultaneously decide to hold their breath. Harry walked to the stool. He was aware of every eye in the room, which was fine. He was always aware of every eye. He sat down. He looked out at the hall for a moment, the Gryffindor table, the Ravenclaw table, the Hufflepuff table, the Slytherin table, the high table with Dumbledore watching him with those mild blue eyes, and McGonagall standing to one side with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally something else entirely. He turned to face forward, and McGonagall lowered the hat onto his head. The hat's magic hit him like stepping from a cold room into a warm one, immediate, enveloping, total. He felt the hat's consciousness reach out and make contact with his own, and there was a moment of mutual assessment that felt, if he was honest, almost like meeting someone. The hat was old and it was layered and it was interested in him in the way of something that had seen 11-year-olds for 1,000 years and genuinely still found them surprising. "Well," said the hat, inside his head, and its mental voice was like old paper and distant thunder. "This is unusual." "I know," Harry thought back. "Do you know how many there are?" 40. He felt the hat pause. Not a processing pause, a surprised pause. "You counted them." "Twice. Most children who come to me have no idea what I'm sensing when I sort them. They're so wrapped up in worrying about which house they'll end up in that they never notice I'm reading the whole of them." The hat's mental voice carried something that might have been appreciation. "You noticed. The first one felt different from my own magic. Once I felt the difference, I couldn't unfeel it." "No," the hat agreed. "I imagine not. These aren't recent." The oldest one, and Harry felt the hat reach deeper, moving through the layers of his magical signature the way a hand moves through water, was placed before you could walk. "I know." Another pause, longer this time. Harry could feel the hat assessing the situation with a thoroughness that was nothing like what he'd expected from a piece of talking headwear. It was working through something. It was working through something significant. "I have sorted 11,247 students, the hat said. "I have never," it paused again, "I have never sat on a child's head and found this many active covert enchantments running through their core magic. Some of these are ministry issue. 3 of them have signatures I associate with the Order of the Phoenix. And the rest, I know what the rest are," Harry thought. "Death Eater workings," the hat said quietly. "Several of them are very old. One of them," and here its mental voice dropped in a way that was hard to describe, something between solemnity and anger, "one of them was placed by the same hand that cast the curse that killed your parents." Harry felt something cold move through him. Not fear. He'd had 10 years to build up walls against things he couldn't control, and what he felt now was more like confirmation. The last piece of a pattern he'd been working out for years clicking into place. "Can you sort me with them active?" The hat was quiet for a moment. Not thinking, listening, the way it had been from the beginning, except now it was listening to something outside Harry's head, something in the room around them. Harry, from the outside, was just sitting under the hat. But on the inside, the hat was very still. "No," it said finally. "I cannot sort you with these active. And I find I am not inclined to pretend I can. What are you going to do?" "What any good teacher does," the hat said, and Harry could hear the decision in its voice, as solid and final as old stone, when a student has been left in a situation that no one has explained to them. "I am going to ask the question." Harry had just enough time to think before the hat's voice filled the great hall. Not inside his head anymore. Out loud. The hat's voice was nothing like its mental voice. In the room it was resonant and enormous and impossibly old, the voice of something that had been watching human beings for longer than most human institutions had existed, and it had the quality of a thing that was done being polite. Albus Dumbledore. The silence in the great hall, which had already been substantial, became something different. It became the silence of a room full of people who understood that something unprecedented was happening and had no framework for processing it. Dumbledore set down his goblet with perfect composure. "Yes, Sorting Hat. I have been asked to sort Harry Potter. The hat's voice was measured but carried the specific weight of an accusation building toward its moment. I find that I cannot do so in good conscience without first addressing what I have discovered in the course of my assessment. Are you prepared to explain to this child, in front of his peers and his teachers, why he has arrived at this school carrying 40 active tracking curses layered into his magical signature? The silence went absolute. 1,000 students. 200 mouths open. Not a fork, not a goblet, not a single rustle of robes. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy had gone the color of old chalk. At the Gryffindor table, Hermione Granger was staring at Harry with the expression of someone whose understanding of the world had just rearranged itself at speed. At the staff table, Professor Quirrell had knocked over his wine glass and didn't seem to have noticed. Professor Snape sat completely still with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing, which was, Harry suspected, the most revealing expression in the room. McGonagall had both hands flat on the table in front of her. Harry couldn't see her face from this angle but he could see her knuckles. Dumbledore had not moved. He looked at the hat, looked at Harry, who was sitting under the hat and watching him back with calm brown eyes that showed nothing in particular, and for a moment, just a moment, something moved behind those famous blue eyes that was neither composure nor wisdom. It was something much more human than either. "I see," Dumbledore said, quietly enough that the entire hall had to lean forward slightly to hear him. "Do you intend to answer?" the hat asked. "I intend to speak with Harry privately, Harry," the hat said, and its voice had not shifted in volume but had acquired a quality that cut through the hall like a blade, "has been spoken with privately for the whole of his life. He has been managed and monitored and made to exist inside boundaries of information that were drawn by other people for their own purposes. He is 11 years old. He is carrying 40 enchantments in his magical core, some of which were placed before he could speak, and not one of which has been explained to him. I have been sorting students for this school for 1,000 years, and I consider myself an extension of Hogwarts itself, and I refuse, Albus, to place this child in a house and send him to bed as though this is normal. As though this is in any way acceptable. If the silence before had been extraordinary, the silence after this was something else entirely. This was the silence of a room full of people encountering history. At the Gryffindor table, Percy Weasley had his mouth open, which Percy Weasley never did. At the staff table, Professor Flitwick had gone entirely still in the alert, frozen way of small animals who have heard something large move nearby. At the Slytherin table, a seventh year whose name Harry didn't yet know was looking at the high table with an expression of controlled, hungry attention. Harry, from the stool, looked at Dumbledore. He was aware that this was the moment. Not the sorting was administrative, but this moment, this particular exchange, was the thing that would define how his years at this school went. How he went. He could feel it the way he could feel magic, as a change in pressure, a shift in the texture of the air around a decision. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. And Harry held his gaze with the same calm he'd held everyone's gaze tonight, and waited, and said nothing, and let the weight of the hat's words sit in the room like furniture. "Perhaps," Dumbledore said, and his voice was very careful now, the voice of a man who had been caught in an open field and was choosing his path toward cover with enormous precision, "I owe Harry more of an explanation than I have provided." "Yes," the hat said. "You do." Dumbledore rose from his seat. The movement was unhurried, and because he was Dumbledore it looked like authority rather than retreat, but Harry noticed the slight pause before he stood, the moment of decision, the moment where he'd weighed his options and chosen forward momentum over stillness. He walked around the high table and down the steps from the dais with his robes sweeping behind him, and the great hall watched every step. He stopped in front of Harry, 5 feet away, and looked down at him with an expression that Harry spent the rest of that night trying to fully categorize and eventually settled on as genuinely sorry. "Harry," he said. "May I sit?" There was nowhere to sit except the floor or the stool Harry was currently occupying, and they both knew it. The question was not logistical. Harry recognized it as what it was, a request for permission, a gesture of acknowledgement that Harry was owed something, an attempt to reframe the dynamic in a room full of witnesses. You can stand, Harry said. I don't mind. The tiny, microscopic shift in Dumbledore's expression was probably invisible to most of the room. Harry caught it. The tracking curses, Dumbledore said, are a consequence of the war. Of Voldemort's defeat, and of the uncertainty that followed it. They were placed by multiple parties, for multiple reasons, and I will not insult your intelligence by pretending they were all placed with your welfare as the primary consideration. How many of them were placed with my welfare as the primary consideration? Harry asked. The directness of it, the voice that was not accusatory but precise, the voice of someone who'd had 10 years to prepare questions, rippled through the room. At the Gryffindor table, Hermione Granger sat up slightly straighter. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. A handful. A handful out of 40. Yes. Who placed the others? That is a longer conversation, it's a yes or no question, Harry said. Can you tell me who placed the others? Dumbledore looked at him steadily. Some of them, yes. Others I am still working to identify. Still working, Harry repeated. In 10 years, you haven't identified all 40. Something moved through the room at that, not a sound, more like a collective shift in physical orientation, everyone adjusting their position in relation to this conversation. McGonagall, at the staff table, closed her eyes briefly. No, Dumbledore said. I have not. The hat said one of them was placed by the person who killed my parents. If the silence had had dimensions before, it now had weight. It pressed down on the great hall like weather. Dumbledore did not flinch. But he breathed, slowly, in a way that a person breathing carefully did not breathe naturally. Yes. That means someone who should be dead, or someone working on their behalf, or someone who used their magic as a template, Harry said. Those are the 3 options. He said it the way he would say it's raining or the train was late, informatively, without embellishment, and the effect of that calm on the room was, he noticed, more destabilizing than anger would have been. Anger was legible. This was not. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment with an expression that Harry would revisit many times over the following years. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it since I was 9, Harry said. I've been thinking about it very carefully. A beat of silence. Then Dumbledore said, quietly enough that it was clearly intended for Harry and not for the room, I am sorry. For the things I have not told you. I know, Harry said. There was nothing unkind in it. There was also nothing forgiving in it. It was simply acknowledgement, one person confirming they'd received another person's statement, and it was, in some ways, more devastating than either alternative would have been. Dumbledore straightened and looked out at the hall, the 1,000 students sitting in arrested silence, the faculty whose various expressions mapped out the full range of human feeling from horror to fascination. There will be a full explanation, he said, and now his voice carried to the room, when I have spoken with Harry privately, and when certain information has been shared with the appropriate parties in the appropriate order. He looked back at Harry. I give you my word. I'll hold you to that, Harry said. Dumbledore inclined his head. He turned and walked back to the high table with the same unhurried composure he'd walked down with, and sat, and looked at the hat with an expression that was professionally mild and personally complicated. Does the hat require anything further, he said, before completing the sorting? The hat was quiet for a moment. Harry felt its attention settle back onto him, warmer now, not the probing assessment of before but the attention of something that had made a decision and felt good about it. You handled that well, it said inside his head. I didn't do anything, Harry thought. You did. You sat still, the hat said. You asked the right questions. You let the weight of it work for you instead of fighting it. That's not nothing. It paused. Now. Where shall I put you? Where do you think? I think, the hat said, with a quality that was very close to warmth, that Godric would be absolutely insufferable about this for centuries. And then, out loud, to the hall, Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry took the hat off, handed it to McGonagall, who took it from him with hands that were not quite steady and looked at him with an expression that had given up on being professionally neutral, and walked to the Gryffindor table. The applause was loud and complicated, the kind of noise that contains more questions than celebration, and Harry sat down next to Hermione Granger, who immediately turned to him with her brown eyes very wide. "That was," she said, and paused, and tried again. "That was, yeah," Harry said. "Do you actually know what all 40 of them are?" "Not all of them. I have theories about most of them." "You've been investigating tracking curses since you were 9. "Since I was 7, technically. It took me 2 years to find books that confirmed what I was feeling." Hermione stared at him. "You could feel them. Can't you feel things that are stuck to your magic?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, with genuine difficulty, "I don't have anything stuck to my magic." "Right," Harry said. "That's what normal feels like, I suppose." She stared at him for another moment. Then, abruptly, she extended her hand. "Hermione Granger." "I know," Harry said, and shook it. "You knocked on my compartment door twice on the train. Once about the toad and once, I wanted to see if you were real," she said, with a bluntness that he appreciated enormously. "Everyone on the train was talking about you and I wanted to make my own assessment." "And?" She considered him for a moment with the seriousness of someone delivering a verdict. "You're interesting," she said. "In ways I didn't anticipate." "Thank you," Harry said, and meant it. The sorting continued. Thomas, Dean. Turpin, Lisa. Weasley, Ron, who had come through the doors last night looking like someone told him Christmas was cancelled and now sat across from Harry with an expression that was cycling rapidly between awe and something more complicated, some mixture of feeling dwarfed and feeling chosen, which was a combination Harry was going to have to watch carefully. Ron wasn't unfriendly. Ron was someone who hadn't figured out yet who he was in relation to Harry Potter, and people like that were wild cards. Zabini, Blaze. Slytherin. The scroll rolled up. The feast appeared, and Harry ate, and around him the conversation started back up slowly, cautiously, like fire starting in wet wood, people talking through what had just happened, testing their interpretations against each other, building the story that would become the version of events that circulated through Hogwarts for the next decade. He let them. Stories were always slightly wrong. Slightly wrong was useful. He was thinking about what the hat had said. One of them was placed by the same hand that cast the curse that killed your parents. Not a Death Eater using Voldemort's magical signature as a template. Not a remaining ally placing a curse that echoed the Dark Lord's work. The hat had been specific. The same hand. Present tense, implied. Active. Recent enough to register as such to a 1,000-year-old instrument of magical assessment. Harry ate his roast chicken and his roast potatoes and his vegetables, and he watched Dumbledore at the high table eating his own meal with perfect composure, and he thought, "You knew. You know. That's what the dreams are. That's what the 2-second looks from McGonagall are. That's what the careful architecture of my entire childhood has been pointing at." He was not afraid. He had built a version of himself that was too well constructed to be easily frightened, and that version of himself sat in the Great Hall of Hogwarts on the first night of his first year and thought through the implications of what had just been said in front of 1,000 witnesses with the methodical patience of someone who had been doing this their entire life. At the high table, Dumbledore lifted his goblet and did not look down at Harry. But Snape did. Snape's eyes were black and assessing and gave away nothing, which was itself a kind of information. Harry met his gaze for a moment and looked back at his plate, and thought, Ministry issue curses. Order of the Phoenix curses. Death Eater curses. 3 categories. Which ones are whose? Neville Longbottom, sitting a few seats down, leaned over and said quietly, "Are you all right?" Harry looked at him. Neville had the earnest face of someone who was asking because he genuinely wanted to know and not because he knew what answer to expect. His eyes were wide and a little anxious and he was holding his fork in both hands. Yes, Harry said, and found that he meant it. Are you? Neville blinked. Nobody had asked him that recently, apparently. Yes. I think so. It's just, what the hat said, I know. Did you really know about them? The curses? Yes. And you just, Neville struggled with something for a moment. You just came here anyway. Where else would I go? Harry said. The curses are everywhere I am. At least here there are books. Neville looked at him for a moment, and something in his face shifted, the anxious quality settling, just slightly, into something more solid. That makes sense, he said, quietly, as though filing it away. Hermione, on Harry's other side, was watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone cataloging data. She had, Harry noticed, already established herself at the table by the mechanism of being so clearly competent that people unconsciously arranged themselves around her as a reference point. The twins farther down were already looking at her with the specific expression of people who had identified someone as someone they needed to know. After dinner, Dumbledore stood and delivered his start-of-term notices, the Forbidden Forest forbidden, Mr. Filch's list of banned items available on request, the third-floor corridor forbidden to those who did not wish to die most painfully, and Harry listened to all of it and noted that the third-floor corridor was being flagged early and loudly, which meant whatever was in it was new this year and someone was drawing a box around it. He filed that away. And I believe, Dumbledore said, and his eyes moved to Harry with an expression that was professionally warm and personally careful, that I owe several members of this hall a more complete conversation than we were able to have this evening. Those discussions will take place. I give my word. He looked away. Now. Off to bed. Percy Weasley herded the first-year Gryffindors through the castle, up staircases that moved, past portraits that watched them go, through corridors that had the layered, textured magic of very old buildings that had been thinking for a very long time, and Harry followed and registered everything he saw and stored it in the organized architecture of his memory the same way he stored everything useful. The Fat Lady's portrait. Caput Draconis. The Gryffindor common room, all red and gold and firelight and the accumulated warmth of centuries of people feeling at home. He stood in it and felt, underneath the warmth, the familiar pressure of his magical signature, the 40 curses sitting in him like pebbles in water, not hurting but present, always present, the constant reminder that he was the most watched person in Britain. For the first time in his life, the watching felt slightly less one-directional. The hat had said it in front of everyone. Dumbledore had promised an explanation in front of everyone. The watching was public now, dragged out of the private architecture of his life and placed in front of 1,000 witnesses. You couldn't manage that back into silence. You couldn't make a room full of students forget what they'd heard. Harry got into his bed, in the dormitory with Ron and Neville and Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan, and pulled the curtains closed, and lay in the dark, and thought. He was tired, genuinely tired in the way that 7 hours on a train and several significant conversations will make you tired, but underneath the tiredness was something else that he hadn't felt in a long time. He tested it carefully, turning it over in his mind. It was something close to looking forward to tomorrow. Not because tomorrow would be safe. Tomorrow would almost certainly involve Dumbledore's explanation, which would be partial and careful and would require Harry to do the same work he always did, reading the space between what was said and what wasn't said, mapping the outline of the truth from the shape of the deflections around it. Tomorrow would involve 100 other students with 100 questions. Tomorrow would involve Snape, probably, whose black eyes had the quality of someone who had already run 14 different versions of this situation and had preferences about the outcomes. But tonight, for the first time in 10 years, Harry had been in a room full of people when someone had said out loud, clearly, in a voice that left no room for management or strategic ambiguity, "This child has been left in an unacceptable situation and someone needs to explain it." The someone was going to explain it. In public. Under witness. He'd take that. He closed his eyes. And in the dormitory, with Ron snoring gently across the room and Neville murmuring something in his sleep about Great Uncle Algy's phone number, Harry Potter fell asleep in the first place he'd ever been that felt, if not exactly home, then at least like it was pointing in the right direction. Outside, above the castle, the night sky was clear. The stars were out. And somewhere in the long dark corridors of Hogwarts, the ancient painting of Godric Gryffindor himself was telling anyone who would listen that he had always thought highly of that hat, always, and that this was exactly the sort of thing a house founder would say if asked. Nobody asked him. But he said it anyway, to the sleeping portraits and the snoring castle and the quiet beginning of what was going to be, Harry Potter's instincts quietly informed him, a very interesting year. Chapter 2, 40 Reasons Harry was awake before anyone else in the dormitory, which he'd expected, and he spent the first grey hour of morning sitting cross-legged on his bed with the curtains drawn, working through the problem the way he always worked through problems, methodically, from the edges inward. 40 curses. 3 categories, as the hat had established. Ministry issue, Order of the Phoenix, and the remainder, which the hat had called Death Eater workings. That breakdown implied 3 distinct parties who had independently decided that tracking Harry Potter was worth the effort and the risk. What Harry needed to determine was not just who had placed them, but when, and more importantly why they were still active. Because that was the thing that had been bothering him since he was 9. Tracking curses weren't passive instruments. They required periodic renewal, a small but consistent expenditure of magical intent from whoever had placed them, or they degraded over time and dissolved back into ambient magic. The fact that all 40 of his were still running, still feeding information somewhere, to someone, meant that all 3 parties were still actively maintaining them. 10 years after the end of the war. 10 years after Voldemort's apparent death. Someone was anticipating a need for the information. He heard Ron roll over and mutter something aggrieved about porridge, and pulled his curtains open. The dormitory was beginning to lighten with morning, grey through the tower windows, and outside the sky over the lake was the color of old pewter. He dressed before the others woke fully, which wasn't difficult. He'd been doing things before other people woke fully for as long as he could remember, since the Dursleys' schedule had required his services before Vernon needed to leave for work and Harry had developed the habit of being useful in the pre-dawn dark. He'd mostly shed the servile part of that habit by now. He'd kept the early mornings, which turned out to be good for thinking. The common room was empty except for a single portrait of a sleeping witch in the corner and the dying fire, which Harry fed 2 logs from the basket beside the grate before sitting in the chair closest to it with a blank piece of parchment and a quill and writing, very neatly at the top, what I know. What I can prove. What I need. He'd gotten through most of the first column and started on the second when the portrait hole opened and Hermione Granger climbed through looking like someone who had also been awake for some time and was annoyed that she'd missed the opportunity to be first. She stopped when she saw him. Looked at the parchment. Looked at him. "How long have you been up?" she said. "Since 5. She came and sat in the chair across from him, which was the chair of someone who was also staying, not someone passing through, and looked at the fire and then at the parchment again. "Is that about last night?" "Yes." "Can I see?" He turned it toward her. She read it with the focused attention she'd applied to everything he'd observed her apply attention to, which was thorough and fast simultaneously. She processed information quickly and visibly, her eyes moving, her face working through reactions as she went. He watched her read and thought about how to use this. She looked up. "You wrote who needs the data in the second column." "Yes." "That's not something you can prove. That's something you'd investigate." "The column headings aren't precise," Harry admitted. "I should have written what I can work toward proving." She looked at the parchment again. "The ministry ones, do you have any sense of which department?" "Department of Magical Law Enforcement would be the obvious guess. But the signatures feel different from what I've read about standard ministry tracking." He paused. "I've read a fair amount about standard ministry tracking." "Where did you find books about tracking curses when you were 9? "Junk shops, mostly. Charity shops that took estate sales. One of them came from a neighbor." He shrugged. "You'd be surprised what ends up in second-hand shops when a wizarding family liquidates an estate and doesn't want to explain the titles to a muggle reseller." Hermione looked at him with an expression that was equal parts impressed and concerned in a proportion that suggested she hadn't yet decided which response was more appropriate. You grew up with Muggles? My mother's sister. Did they know that I was being tracked? Harry considered. I think my aunt knew more than she admitted. She never said anything directly. But she'd catch me reading certain books and the expression she made wasn't surprise. It was more like someone watching a child find a thing they'd hoped the child wouldn't find for a while longer. Hermione absorbed this. The fire crackled between them. Outside the windows, the grey was beginning to lighten toward white. Dumbledore's explanation this morning, she said. Yes. He'll control it. He'll decide how much to say and in what order. Obviously. So you need to know what questions to ask before he decides what to offer. Harry looked at her steadily. She was 11 years old and had just laid out, without preamble, the central strategic challenge of the morning with complete accuracy. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. She pulled the parchment toward her, picked up his quill without asking, and wrote something in the second column. Handed it back. She'd written, which curses did D know about before they were placed versus after? If he knew before some of them were placed, she said, and didn't stop them, that's a different problem than if he only found out afterward. It's a significantly different problem, Harry agreed. Ron appeared at the bottom of the stairs at 7:30, looking like he'd been constructed in a hurry from leftover parts, and stopped when he saw them at the fire. His expression went through 3 distinct phases: recognition, something more complicated about the two of them being already deep in conversation, and then the deliberate setting aside of that complication in favor of the present moment, which Harry appreciated. Breakfast? Ron said. In a minute, Harry said. He folded the parchment and tucked it in his robes. McGonagall found Harry in the entrance hall before breakfast, which was, given that she was a woman who normally communicated administrative information through very precise notes delivered by very punctual owls, a choice that said something. She appeared from a side corridor with the air of someone who had been waiting for the right moment, which meant she'd been tracking his movements, which meant she'd known he'd be down early. Which meant she'd made inquiries. Mr. Potter. She looked at him with the direct, uncomfortable gaze of someone who had made a decision overnight and was going to act on it regardless of the personal cost. The headmaster will see you after breakfast. In his office. Will you be there? Harry said. The question caught her slightly off guard, which told him something. She hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected him to ask for her specifically, and the fact that he had mattered to her in a way she was working to control. That is not typically, I'd like you to be there, Harry said. If that's possible. I think you know things that are relevant to my situation and I think you'd say them more directly than the headmaster would. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. The entrance hall was beginning to fill with students drifting toward breakfast, the sound of footsteps and morning conversation building around them, and she was very still in the middle of it, the way still things are when they are being still on purpose. I will make certain I am available, she said. Thank you, Professor. She turned to go and then stopped, and he could feel the thing she was deciding whether to say working through her, the effort of it in the set of her shoulders. She turned back. For what it's worth, she said, quietly, what the hat said last night was correct. You deserve to know. You should have known long before now. She paused. That is all. She walked away and Harry watched her go and thought, ally. Provisional, complicated, carrying her own guilt about this. But ally. Breakfast was extraordinary in the specific way of first mornings, the ceiling showed a pale blue autumn sky, the tables were loaded with everything, and the mail arrived in a rush of owls that swept through the great hall in a living current of wings and wind and the smell of the outside. Harry watched the owls without expectation. Nobody had ever sent him mail. The Dursleys received letters from Petunia's book club and Vernon's golf magazine, and Harry had spent his life watching other people's correspondence arrive and not waiting for his own. 3 letters landed in front of him. He looked at them without reaching for them. Ron, beside him, had a copy of the Daily Prophet that his mother's owl had delivered, and across the table Hermione had a small parcel that turned out to contain a letter from her parents and a very advanced charms reference book that made Hermione make a sound that was clearly involuntary. Harry looked at the 3 letters. The first had ministry seals on the outside and his name written in the bureaucratic precision of official correspondence. The second had no markings at all, no address, no seal, no indication of how it had arrived or through whom. The third was from Gringotts, which he recognized by the distinctive cream parchment and the sharp copperplate script of Goblin formal correspondence. He opened the Gringotts one first. Dear Mr. Potter, it read, we note with interest the public discussion of certain enchantments attached to your person which took place at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry on the evening of September 1st. We wish to advise you that Gringotts maintains records of all magical instruments registered with the bank, including those attached to vaults, persons, and assets of account holders. Should you wish to review the record of enchantments associated with your vaults and person as held by this institution, you may request an appointment with your account manager at your earliest convenience. We remain, as always, at your service. It was signed by someone whose goblin name took up 3 lines. Harry folded it carefully and put it in his robes. The ministry letter was longer, colder, and had been written, he could tell by the phrasing, by someone who had composed it in a hurry and was very angry about needing to. It was from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and it explained, in the elaborate bureaucratic language of a department that knew it was explaining itself to an 11-year-old and resented the necessity, that certain monitoring enchantments placed on his person were standard procedure for individuals classified as persons of elevated magical significance and that all such enchantments had been placed in accordance with Ministry Regulation 47(b) of the Magical Persons Protection Act. And that Harry should not be alarmed or unduly concerned by their presence. It was signed by someone whose title took up 2 lines. Harry read it twice and noted the things that were not in it. No accounting of how many ministry curses were attached to him, no acknowledgement of the non-ministry ones, and, most importantly, no explanation of who was receiving the data the monitoring enchantments collected or what they were doing with it. He folded that one and put it away too. The unmarked letter he opened last, and he opened it carefully, running a finger along the fold before breaking the seal in case there was anything reactive in the paper, which there wasn't, but it was worth checking. The letter was a single line. You should know that the headmaster does not know who placed 12 of them. That was it. No signature. No indication of sender. The handwriting was neat and controlled, and the ink was a specific shade of blue-black that Harry had only seen once, in a book on advanced curse composition that had been in the junk shop in Little Whinging, sitting next to a slightly damaged copy of Practical Occlumency for the Cautious Mind, which was where Harry had first learned to organize the architecture of his own thoughts. He looked at the letter for a long moment, then folded it with the others and reached for the pumpkin juice. Hermione, who had been attempting to appear absorbed in her book and failing, said quietly, 3 letters on the first morning. One from Gringotts, one from the ministry, one from someone who didn't sign their name. Her head came up. Someone who didn't, it told me that Dumbledore doesn't know who placed 12 of the 40. Ron, who had given up on pretending he wasn't listening, put his newspaper down. Someone's just telling you things. Who? I don't know yet, Harry said. Doesn't that worry you? Harry considered the question seriously. Someone who wanted to harm me wouldn't tip their hand by sending useful information. And the information is verifiable, I can confirm it against what Dumbledore tells me this morning. If it matches, the sender is reliable. If it doesn't, I know Dumbledore's withholding something specific. He paused. Either way, the letter is useful. Ron stared at him. You think about things differently than anyone I've ever met. People keep telling me that, Harry said, and poured himself more juice. Dumbledore's office was reached through a gargoyle that leapt aside when McGonagall said sherbet lemon with the specific intonation of someone who found suites-based security protocols professionally beneath them, and the circular room beyond was, Harry registered immediately, a room that was doing a lot of work simultaneously. Books, instruments, portraits of previous headmasters who were tracking Harry's entry with varying degrees of subtlety. The sorting hat on its shelf, which regarded Harry with what felt like acknowledgement. A magnificent bird on a golden perch, a phoenix, actually singing, a low and private melody, and behind the desk, Dumbledore, who rose as they entered. McGonagall had come. She took a chair to one side with the posture of someone positioning themselves as a witness rather than a participant, and Harry appreciated the precision of that choice enormously. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "Please, sit." Harry sat. He placed his hands in his lap and looked at Dumbledore steadily and waited. Dumbledore sat too. He looked, in the morning light, older than he had in the Great Hall, or perhaps more accurately, more aware of his own age, more willing to let it show. The elaborate serenity was still there, but it was slightly thinner, the way paint looks slightly thinner in morning light than evening. "I imagine," Dumbledore said, "you have questions." "I do," Harry said. "But I thought you'd start with the explanation you promised in front of 1,000 witnesses last night." Something that might have been appreciation moved in the old man's eyes. "Fair," he said. "Then I'll start at the beginning. Or rather, at the end that became a beginning." He folded his hands on the desk. "When Voldemort, when he came to your parents' house in Godric's Hollow, the spell he cast on you, rebounded. I know that part." "You know," Dumbledore paused. "Of course. You've been reading." "Everything I could find." "Which wasn't much. There's a lot that's been deliberately kept out of the public record." Dumbledore acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. "The rebounded curse, and the nature of your survival, marked you in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone sensitive to magical signatures. In the days and weeks after Godric's Hollow, while Voldemort's followers were being rounded up and while the wizarding world was beginning to understand what had happened," he paused, "you were being examined. By many parties. And some of those parties did not restrict themselves to examination. They placed tracking curses. Yes. In the chaos of those weeks, there was very little centralized oversight. The ministry was, in disarray. The Order of the Phoenix had suffered losses. Information about your location was being sought by parties whose motivations ranged from protectiveness to," he stopped. "To what?" Dumbledore looked at him. "To wanting to ensure the thing that had killed Voldemort could be found again if needed." The room was quiet. The Phoenix sang its low private song. McGonagall, in her chair, was looking at a point on the wall with the expression of someone choosing where to put their eyes very carefully. "They wanted me as a weapon," Harry said. "Some of them." "Yes." "Who?" "Within the ministry, there was a faction, there remains a faction, that views your existence primarily in strategic terms. Not because they are cruel people, necessarily, but because they fought a war and the war shaped how they think about power." Dumbledore's voice was very even. "The tracking enchantments from the ministry were placed by members of that faction, without the knowledge or authorization of the Minister for Magic at the time. Unofficial ministry tracking. Rogue operation." "Yes. And they're still active, which means the faction is still active, 10 years later." Harry thought about the ministry letter he'd received at breakfast. "The letter I got this morning from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement cited the Magical Persons Protection Act. That's a different department from the one you're describing." Dumbledore's eyes sharpened. "You received a letter from the ministry this morning." 3 letters. Gringotts, ministry, and an unsigned one." A pause. "An unsigned, it told me you don't know who placed 12 of the 40. Harry watched Dumbledore's face with complete attention. "Is that accurate?" The pause was a fraction of a second too long. It was the most honest moment they'd had. "Yes," Dumbledore said. 12 of them have signatures that I have not been able to trace to a source. They predate several of the others, and their construction is unlike any dark magic I am familiar with. The hat said one was placed by the same hand that killed my parents." "Yes." Dumbledore's voice lost something when he said it, not composure exactly, but something beneath composure, something that had less to do with how he was presenting himself and more to do with what he actually felt. That particular enchantment is one of the 12 I cannot identify. You can't trace the maker, or you won't say. McGonagall made a very small sound. Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression that had moved past complicated and into territory that Harry didn't have a word for yet. Both things are true, he said, in a way that is difficult to explain without, try, Harry said. Another pause. Then, I believe the enchantment was placed by a remnant of Voldemort's consciousness. Not Voldemort himself, not a full return. Something smaller. A fragment of intent that persisted after the rebounded curse should have killed him. He paused. I have not been able to determine where that fragment resides. Which is why the enchantment still feels active. The room was very quiet. Harry worked through this. He worked through it the way he worked through difficult passages in books, without hurrying, without panic, holding each piece up against what he already knew and seeing where the fit was and where the gaps were. A fragment of Voldemort's consciousness. Persistent. Unlocated. The tracking curse from that fragment, Harry said. It's not tracking my location. Dumbledore's expression changed. No, he said quietly. It is not. It's tracking my magical development. McGonagall's head turned toward Harry with a sharp, involuntary movement that told him this was new information to her. Yes, Dumbledore said. It is a rudimentary form of, the curse is feeding information about your magical growth back to whatever remains of the caster. Monitoring your power as it develops. So wherever the fragment is, it's been watching me get stronger for 10 years. In essence. Yes. Harry sat with that for a moment. Outside, through the high windows of the office, the morning sky had turned from white to a pale watery blue, and he could hear distantly the sounds of Hogwarts starting its day, footsteps, voices, the distant clang of something in a classroom being dropped. What about the Order of the Phoenix ones? Harry said. Dumbledore breathed. Those were placed by myself and 2 other Order members, in the weeks after Godric's Hollow, for the purpose of monitoring your safety. They have remained active because, he stopped. Because you've been using them, Harry said. To check on me. To ensure you were alive. To ensure you were, you could have just asked the Dursleys. The Dursleys were not always forthcoming, you could have visited. You could have had someone check on me in person. You could have written to me. Harry's voice was not raised. It was, if anything, quieter than it had been. You could have told me what you were doing and asked permission. I was old enough to understand by the time I was 7. He paused. You didn't do any of those things. You put tracking curses in my magical core and watched from a distance. McGonagall looked at her hands. Dumbledore looked at Harry with the expression Harry had been trying to categorize since last night and now recognized for what it was, the expression of a person encountering the full weight of a choice they'd made for good reasons, holding it up in the light and being unable to defend the shape of it. No, he said. I didn't. And I am deeply sorry for that. I know, Harry said, for the second time in 2 days, and the second time the quality of it was the same, received, acknowledged, not forgiven, not unforgiven. Present. Dumbledore held his gaze. You are not going to tell me it's all right. No. Because it isn't. Harry tilted his head slightly. But I'm not interested in making this about how angry I am. I'd like to focus on what's useful. Can you remove the Order curses? Yes. If you consent to it, I can remove all 3. Do it now, please. Dumbledore rose and came around the desk, and Harry sat still while the old man worked. He felt the magic in it, the careful unthreading, the curses lifting free of his signature one at a time with the small, clean sensation of splinters being removed. 3 fewer. 37 remaining. When it was done, Dumbledore stepped back, and Harry felt his magical signature change slightly, lighter, or more accurately, less encumbered in 3 specific places. He tested it in the way he'd learned to do, running his attention through the remaining curses, checking their positions hadn't shifted. The Ministry ones, Harry said. Can you remove those? Not without ministry authorization, technically. They are considered official instruments, even the unauthorized ones. The process of removing them would require me to first acknowledge, then we'll deal with those through Gringotts, Harry said. I have an appointment to make. He reached into his robes and showed Dumbledore the Gringotts letter. Dumbledore looked at it with an expression of mild surprise. The goblins move quickly. They track everything that happens to assets they're responsible for. My vaults are their responsibility. Apparently I am too. Harry put the letter away. The Death Eater ones. Can you identify which families placed them? Some. 4 of them have signatures consistent with former Death Eaters now serving sentences in Azkaban. The mechanism of maintenance for those is unclear. They may be running on residual intent, decaying slowly, which would explain why they feel older and less precise. And the 12 you can't identify. Those are beyond my current ability to address safely, Dumbledore said. Some of them are very complexly constructed. Attempting to remove them without understanding their architecture he hesitated. Could damage my magical core, Harry finished. I know. I read about compounded curse removal in most Patendi curses. Dumbledore stared at him for a moment. That text is not in Hogwarts library. No, Harry agreed. It isn't. Silence. The fragment, Harry said. The one you think is Voldemort's consciousness. Where do you think it is? And here Dumbledore paused for a long time. The phoenix made a soft sound. McGonagall, in her chair, had gone very still in the specific stillness of someone who knew what was coming and was bracing for it. I have a theory, Dumbledore said. It isn't proven. It is, the implications of it are significant enough that I have been reluctant to voice it before I have more evidence. Voice it now, Harry said. Harry, you promised an explanation. Harry met the old man's gaze. I'm not asking you to stake your life on it. I'm asking you what you think. Your actual theory, not a safe version of it. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long moment, and Harry looked back, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not warmth exactly, not yet, it was too early for warmth, but something more like the beginning of an honest working relationship between 2 people who were, for the first time, choosing to be in the same room with the same information at the same time. I believe, Dumbledore said, slowly, that a fragment of Voldemort's consciousness survived the rebounded curse by anchoring itself to an object. Possibly more than one object. I believe these objects still exist and that they are the reason the curse attached to your core still runs actively. The fragment that placed it can only maintain the curse so long as it persists, and it persists because it is held to this world by something that was imbued with, he paused, with a piece of Voldemort's soul. The words sat in the room. McGonagall stood up. She moved to the window and stood with her back to them, and Harry could see her shoulders, the way they'd risen and then descended in one long controlled breath. Soul magic, Harry said. Yes. Dark. Illegal. Incredibly difficult. And if he made more than one, the tracking curse would persist for as long as any one of them exists, Dumbledore said. Yes. That is what I believe. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, and you've had this theory for how long? I have had some version of it, Dumbledore said carefully, for several years. But you didn't tell me. You were 8. 9. You were, carrying a curse that's feeding my magical development directly to whatever's left of him. Harry's voice was still calm, still even, but there was something under it now that hadn't been there before, not anger, something colder, something that was the emotional temperature of a decision being made. Every time I learned something. Every time I got stronger. Every time I practiced anything, he felt it. Possibly. We don't know the specificity of, for 10 years, Harry said. While you knew. The room was silent. Yes, Dumbledore said. And then, because there was nothing else to say and the old man, for all his faults, apparently knew when there was nothing else to say, yes. I'm sorry. That was wrong. Harry nodded once. He stood up. He smoothed his robes, which didn't need smoothing but gave his hands something to do while the rest of him processed the scope of what he'd just been told. Then he looked at McGonagall, whose back was still to the room. Professor McGonagall. She turned. Her face was professionally composed and personally devastated. Did you know about the soul magic theory? A pause. No, she said. Not until this moment. Do you believe him? Yes, she said, without hesitation. I do. Good. He looked at Dumbledore. I want to start working on the Unknown 12 as soon as possible. I want access to Hogwarts' full library, including the restricted section, as of today. I want to write to Gringotts and arrange an appointment for the earliest possible date. And I want to be informed, going forward, of anything you learn about the objects you just described. Dumbledore looked at him steadily. I agree to all of that. I'll need a pass for the restricted section in writing. Dumbledore picked up a quill from his desk and wrote one immediately. He signed it with a flourish that was, despite everything, very Dumbledore, and extended it. Harry took it. Thank you. He was at the door when Dumbledore said, Harry. He stopped. The unsigned letter. The one that told you I didn't know about 12 of them. Yes. Do you still have it? Harry turned and looked at the old man. Yes. I would very much like to know who sent it. So would I, Harry said. I'll let you know when I find out. And he opened the door and walked into the corridor, and let it close behind him. He stood in the corridor for a moment, alone, with the pass for the restricted section in one hand and 37 tracking curses in his magical signature and the knowledge that somewhere in the world there were objects that contained pieces of a dead Dark Lord's soul and that one of the curses woven into his core had been feeding his entire childhood, every moment of magical growth and development, back to whatever was left of that Dark Lord. He stood with all of that for exactly as long as he needed to, which was about 30 seconds, and then started walking toward breakfast, because he had classes today and he wasn't going to miss them, and because the only direction that had ever made sense was forward. By the time he reached the bottom of the moving staircase, he'd already started on the second list, what I need to learn to do next. At the top of that list, underlined in his mind, was a single item, find Hermione Granger. She was going to have opinions about this. He realized with something that was close to surprise, actually looking forward to hearing them. The great hall was still half full of breakfast stragglers, and Hermione was precisely where he expected her, at the Gryffindor table with her charms book propped open against the juice pitcher, eating toast with the automatic precision of someone fueling a machine while the machine's real attention was elsewhere. She looked up when he sat down. Read his face in about a second. How bad? Significant, he said. But manageable. He looked at Ron, who was still working through a third helping of eggs with the uncomplicated appetite of someone who had not spent the morning in Dumbledore's office. Ron. What do you know about soul magic? Ron's fork stopped. He looked at Harry with the specific expression of someone who has just heard the tone of a question and understood that the question is not casual. My mum uses that word like a swear word, he said. Means something terrible's happened with someone's soul. She doesn't talk about it beyond that. That's consistent with what I just learned, Harry said. Ron put his fork down. Right. Okay. He looked at Harry, then at Hermione, then back at Harry. You're going to tell us, yeah? Yes, Harry said. Both of you. But not here. He glanced at the other students around them, the chatter and clatter of breakfast, a dozen conversations that could absorb a bit of his, but not this specific one. Later. Somewhere quiet. Hermione nodded, her toast halfway to her mouth. The library. Tonight after dinner. The library's public. I know where the quiet corner is, she said. I found it this morning at 6:30. Nobody goes past the restricted section door in the evenings. Harry considered her. How long were you in there this morning? 2 hours. She said it with complete unapology. It's an exceptional library. It's about to get more exceptional, Harry said, and pulled the restricted section pass out of his robes and laid it on the table. She looked at it. She looked at him. She looked at it again. He just gave that to you. I asked for it. You asked for it, she said, in the tone of someone recalibrating their understanding of how the world worked. In exchange for explaining what was in the meeting, Harry said. That's the deal. I ask for things. He tells me things. We both stop pretending we're operating in separate information environments. Ron picked up the pass and read it and set it down with the careful reverence of someone handling something slightly radioactive. That's got Dumbledore's actual signature on it. I know. Can I, he looked at Harry. Can I come too? To the library thing tonight? Yes, Harry said simply. Ron looked, for the first time since the train, like he'd decided something. The complicated mixture of awe and uncertainty that he'd been carrying around Harry since yesterday settled, not gone but reconfigured, into something more like simply being in the room with someone without needing the room to mean something. It was a better look on him. Good, Ron said, and picked up his fork again. After dinner, then. Across the hall, at the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was watching them with the careful attention of someone who had been told to watch. Harry caught his eye for a moment and held it and then looked away, and thought, someone told him to. Someone with a stake in what I learned this morning. Someone who received the information before I did. He looked down at his pumpkin juice. Thought about the unsigned letter. You should know that the headmaster does not know who placed 12 of them. The ink that matched a book from a junk shop in Little Whinging. Someone with access to obscure magical texts. Someone watching him independently of the 40 curses, or through them. He was missing something. It was right at the edge of the information he had, the shape of something in the gap between what the hat had said and what Dumbledore had explained and what the unsigned letter had offered. He looked up. At the staff table, Professor Quirrell was eating his breakfast and laughing at something Flitwick was saying, and the purple turban he always apparently wore was sitting slightly off-center in a way that made the back of Harry's neck do something. He made a mental note. Filed it away. First class is Transfiguration, Hermione said, already standing and gathering her bag. With McGonagall. We should go. Harry stood. 37 curses. 11 unknown senders. 1 missing piece he couldn't yet name. And first-year Transfiguration in 11 minutes. Let's go, he said. Chapter 3, The Weight of Watching Transfiguration was the first class where Harry understood what magic was actually supposed to feel like. Not the accidental kind, the kind he'd been doing his whole life without meaning to, the teapot that turned itself on when he was cold, the book that fell open to the right page, the time he'd ended up on the school roof to escape Dudley's gang and had no memory of climbing there. That magic had always felt reactive, defensive, an organism's response to pressure. What McGonagall put in front of him, a match, a needle, the instruction to make one become the other, required something different. It required intent combined with precision combined with trust, and the combination was extraordinary. He had the match silver and pointed at both ends inside 4 minutes. McGonagall looked at it for a long moment without speaking, then set it down and went to check on the other students, and her expression on the way past was the expression of someone filing something away under a label they'd already written. Hermione got hers to go silver at the 6-minute mark and made a sound of satisfaction that was private but audible. She looked across at Harry's already completed needle and made a different sound, which was less private. How did you do it so fast, she said, quietly, while McGonagall was helping Neville at the back of the room. I thought about what a needle already is, Harry said. Metal, thin, sharp at one end. The match is most of that already. I just asked it to remember. Hermione turned this over visibly. Asked it to remember, she repeated. Transfiguration isn't forcing things, Harry said. That's what the textbook made it sound like, forcing one thing to become another. But that's not how it felt. It felt like conversation. She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize as her specific version of impressed, which was different from her general version of interested and distinguished primarily by the slight unwillingness in it, as though she hadn't planned to be impressed and was mildly annoyed at the development. Then she looked at her own needle match and back at his. "Ask it to remember," she said again, half to herself, and turned back to her own work. At the back of the room, Neville had gone slightly pale. Harry glanced back and saw it, not the concentration of someone working but the tight, shut-in expression of someone who was afraid to try. His hands were flat on the table on either side of the match, like he was keeping it in place rather than transforming it, and his jaw was set in the specific way of people bracing for failure. Harry turned back to his own work and picked up the needle and set it back down. "Neville," he said, not loudly, just loud enough. Neville looked up. "Don't look at the match," Harry said. "Look at what you want." McGonagall, who was 2 desks away, stopped moving. She didn't turn around. Neville looked at Harry with an expression that said he wasn't sure if the advice was serious. Then he looked at the middle distance, the place where the needle that wasn't there yet might be, and his hands relaxed very slightly, and something happened to the match. It didn't fully transform but it shivered, and one end went thin and sharp and briefly silver before he lost it and it bounced back. It was more than he'd done in the previous 10 minutes. Neville stared at it. He looked at Harry. Something shifted in his face that had nothing to do with the match and everything to do with the 10 years of being told, in various ways, that the magic wasn't really in him. "Again," Harry said, and turned back to his own desk. He heard Neville try again, and this time the match went silver and stayed silver on one end, and he heard McGonagall say, quietly, "Well done, Mr. Longbottom," in a voice that contained more genuine warmth than most of the compliments Harry had ever heard. Potions was in the dungeons, which were cold in the specific way of underground spaces that had been cold for hundreds of years and had made peace with it. Harry had read about potions. He'd read the textbook twice and one additional reference text he'd found, and he understood the theory well enough that the first lesson, basic principles, explanation of the year's curriculum, no actual brewing, held very little that was new to him. What was new was Snape. He swept in with the particular movement of someone who had calculated the exact amount of presence required to command a room and deployed it habitually, and he began talking without preamble in a voice that was low enough to require attention. "You are here," Snape said, moving between the work tables, "to learn to brew. Not to theorize. Not to discuss. Not to understand in the abstract. To brew." He stopped at the front. "I can teach you to bottle fame, brew glory, even stopper death, if you aren't as great a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach." His eyes moved across the room and came to Harry, and sat there. Harry had been expecting something. He hadn't known what shape it would come in. The look Snape gave him was unlike any of the looks he'd received from adults in the last 2 days. It wasn't Dumbledore's complicated warmth, wasn't McGonagall's complicated guilt, wasn't Hagrid's uncomplicated affection. It was the look of someone who had been standing at the intersection of history and personal grief for 10 years and had organized all of it into something very controlled and very black-eyed and very watchful. "Potter," Snape said. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry knew this. "Draft of Living Death." He'd read it. "The Draft of Living Death," he said. A pause. "Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" "Stomach of a goat." Another pause, slightly longer. "What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "They're the same plant," Harry said. "Also called aconite. The different names refer to different preparation contexts in traditional texts, monkshood in European herbology, wolfsbane in werewolf-specific curse-breaking traditions." The room was very quiet. Harry hadn't said it to perform. He'd said it because it was the answer. He'd spent a long time in junk shops and charity sales and he'd had very little to do in the evenings at the Dursleys that was better than reading, and potions theory was interesting in the way of any system that had internal logic. It rewarded attention. Snape looked at him for a long, still moment. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, in the tone of someone paying a debt they resent. Don't be smug about it. I'm not, Harry said. And he wasn't. Snape held his gaze for another moment. Harry held it back, not as a challenge but as simple steadiness, the same way he'd held Dumbledore's gaze and McGonagall's and every other adult's gaze in the last 24 hours. He wasn't performing confidence. He simply wasn't going to look away. Something happened in Snape's face, a small, contained thing, over in a moment. Then he moved on. For the rest of the lesson Harry watched Snape move through the room and thought about the tracking curse signatures the hat had attributed to the Order of the Phoenix. 3. Dumbledore had claimed all 3. But the hat had said 2 other Order members. Which meant Dumbledore had removed his own, but there were potentially 2 others, whose owners were possibly in this school, possibly in this room. He looked at Snape's back and thought about black ink that matched a book from a little whinging junk shop. He filed it away. By Thursday, Harry had established a rhythm. Mornings, classes. He discovered, exceptionally good at charms, reasonably good at transfiguration, interested in potions in a way that Snape seemed to find simultaneously satisfying and personally inconvenient, and bored by history of magic in the specific way of someone who knew the material but found the delivery style. Professor Binns was a ghost who had apparently never noticed his own death and taught accordingly, inadequate to the content. He learned everything Binns said anyway, because information was information regardless of how it arrived. Evenings, the library. The 3 of them, Harry, Hermione, Ron, had established a table in the far corner, past the restricted section door, where the shelves were oldest and the light was worst and nobody else came unless they were lost. Hermione had spent the first night building an organizational system for their research that she'd drawn out on 3 sheets of parchment with cross-referencing footnotes. Ron had looked at it and said it was terrifying, which Hermione had taken as a compliment. The work was this: understanding the 12 unknown tracking curses well enough to begin identifying their authors. Hermione had, within 48 hours of getting the restricted section pass, developed a methodology. She pulled every text on curse composition, dark object theory, and magical signature analysis and worked through them with the focused intensity of someone who found a good problem more satisfying than almost anything else. She made notes constantly. She argued with the books in the margins. Ron had turned out to have a different and complementary kind of useful. His knowledge of wizarding families was encyclopedic in the way of someone who'd grown up surrounded by family history, not from books but from dinner-table conversation and his mother's running commentary on everything. He knew who was related to whom, which families had dark affinities, which ones had publicly supported Voldemort and which ones had done it quietly, and which ones nobody had ever accused but his mom made a face whenever their name came up. The Vane family, Ron said on Thursday evening, running his finger down a page. Old family. Not Death Eaters exactly, but, he made a face that was a precise imitation of his mother's face. They had what Dad calls adjacent sympathies. There was one, Isolde Vane, I think. Mom gets very quiet when that name comes up. Harry looked up from the curse composition text he was reading. What do you know about her? Not much. She was at Hogwarts the same year as my uncles, I think. She's not in Azkaban. Ron paused. Mom going quiet isn't the same as going to Azkaban. Some people who should be there aren't. He said it with the matter-of-fact bitterness of someone who'd heard that truth their whole life. Why? I'm building a list of possibilities for the unknown 12, Harry said. People with the skill, the motive, and the freedom of movement to have placed a tracking curse in 1981 and maintain it for 10 years without detection. Isolde Vane keeps showing up in the margins of things. Hermione looked up. She's mentioned in this, she said, pulling a book from her stack and opening it to a page she'd flagged. Cited as a theorist of what the author calls deep embedding. It's a method of fusing a curse with the target's own magical signature so thoroughly that the curse reads as natural. Undetectable by standard scanning. The author doesn't say it approvingly. Deep embedding, Harry said. He thought about the 12 unknown curses and the way they sat in his signature, not layered on top like the others, not attached to the outside, but woven in, present in the way that the color of his eyes was present. That's what they feel like. Not stuck on. Part of the weave. If that's the construction method, Hermione said slowly, then they're not trackable back to their maker through standard signature analysis. Because the maker's signature isn't in the curse. It's been removed from the construction. How do you find the maker then? Ron said. You find who knew how to do it, Harry said. The technique itself is the signature. They sat with that for a moment. I need to write to Gringotts, Harry said. The goblins maintain records of magical instruments, maybe they have records of deep embedding work. It's complex enough that it might have been registered somewhere. Hermione was already writing a note to herself. I'll look for precedent in the curse removal texts. If anyone's had this done before and had it successfully removed, there might be a case record. Ron was watching Harry with the thoughtful expression he got when he was putting things together. Harry, he said. The letter you got on the first morning. The one without a signature. Yes. Do you think it's the same person? Isolde Vane. Harry had been thinking about this for 3 days. The information in it was useful and accurate. If it was Vane, and she's the one who placed 12 deep embedded tracking curses in my magical core, then she's simultaneously giving me tools to identify her. That's either arrogant or deliberate, Hermione said. Deliberate. Harry nodded. She wants me to know. Or she wants me to know on her timeline, in a controlled way. Which means she's planning something that involves me knowing who she is. He paused. Or she's warning me. Warning you about what? Ron said. About the 11 other unknown placers, Harry said. The library was quiet around them. The candles burned low over the old shelves and the books breathed out the particular atmosphere of old paper and accumulated knowledge, and none of the 3 of them spoke for a moment. I don't think Dumbledore knows about deep embedding, Harry said. He would have recognized it, Hermione agreed. He described the 12 as unknown and beyond his ability to safely address. That's different from recognized but difficult. Harry closed the book in front of him. He's working with incomplete information about a technique that's more advanced than his reference framework. That's, Ron paused. Dumbledore not knowing something feels wrong. He knows a lot, Harry said. But knowledge has edges. His edges happen to be in the specific area that's most relevant to my situation. He picked up his quill. Which is useful to know. Friday morning brought the first flying lesson, which was outdoors in the cold bright air, and Harry had been looking forward to it in the private way of someone who has been looking forward to something for their entire life without admitting it. The brooms came up on the first try, which the instructor, Madame Hooch, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, looked mildly impressed by. Harry gripped his and felt the magic in it hum against his palm, a responsive living thing, and he thought about what he'd said to Hermione about transfiguration, not forcing, conversation. He thought about asking rather than commanding. The broom rose so smoothly it surprised even him. What happened next surprised everyone else more. Neville, nervous on his broom, kicked off too hard and went rocketing upward, lost control, bounced off the castle wall, and was blown sideways across the courtyard by a gust of wind. His hand opened. Draco Malfoy's hand shot out and caught the remembrall that had been clutched in Neville's fist, which was not what Harry had been watching. He'd been watching Neville, making sure Neville's broom didn't throw him, and when Neville came down shaking and scraped and Draco held up the remembrall with a smirk and said he'd give it back when he felt like it, Harry was already in the air. Not chasing Draco. He hadn't gone after Draco at all. He'd gone straight up, and when Draco looked up with the baffled expression of someone who'd expected pursuit and gotten something else entirely, Harry was 15 feet above him and looking down at him with an expression of perfect equanimity. "Throw it," Harry said. "Or what?" Draco said, which was bluster, it was visible even from 15 feet. "Or nothing," Harry said. "Throw it up and I'll catch it." Or keep it, and everyone here has a story about the time Draco Malfoy stole a first-year's Remembrall because it was the best option available to him. The courtyard was very quiet. 8 first-years and Madame Hooch all looking at Harry 15 feet up on a broom with the ease of someone sitting in a chair. Draco's jaw worked. He threw the Remembrall upward, not gently, hard, the kind of throw designed to make catching it difficult. Harry didn't even adjust his broom. He just leaned slightly and caught it one-handed and dropped back down in a long, unhurried descent that deposited him on the ground without a jolt. He walked over to Neville and handed it to him. "You all right?" Neville's scraped hands closed around the Remembrall. He looked at Harry with an expression that had bypassed gratitude and gone somewhere more significant. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'm all right." Madame Hooch was staring at Harry with both eyebrows up. "Potter," she said. "That was, where have you flown before?" "I haven't," Harry said. She stared at him for another moment. Then she said, briskly, "Right. Class." Back in position, and turned away, but Harry could see her marking something on her clipboard with the decisive strike of someone making a note they intend to follow up on. From across the courtyard, Draco Malfoy looked at Harry with an expression that had moved past wounded pride into something more careful and more complicated. Harry met it and held it and thought, not an enemy. Not yet. Possibly not ever, depending on choices. But someone whose father is watching this school very carefully. He looked away first again. Same cost, same reasoning. Saturday morning. Harry was in the library at 7, which was earlier than his usual library time, but he'd woken at 5 with the specific alertness of someone whose brain had solved something in the night. He'd been through the process of elimination on the deep embedding technique, and the problem he kept running into was access. Deep embedding required physical proximity to the target at the time of casting. You couldn't do it from a distance. You needed to be close enough to work directly with the target's magical signature. Which meant every person who had placed one of the 12 unknown curses had been physically near him at some point in the 10 years since Godric's Hollow. Which meant they either had legitimate reasons to be near him, family, officials, the Dursleys' visitors, or they had manufactured reasons, which required resources and planning. He'd brought this problem to the library along with the restricted section pass and a specific text he'd found by asking a library house elf. They existed, the Hogwarts library elves, ancient and small and extremely knowledgeable about the locations of things, who had retrieved for him a text called The Body of Magic, Curse Analysis and Personal Signature Alteration. Written in 1847 by a healer named Portentia Smythe, whose entire career had apparently been devoted to curse removal from magical cores. He read for an hour before Hermione arrived and 2 hours before Ron, who appeared with a plate of toast from the Great Hall because he had, in 3 days, independently decided that Saturday library sessions required provisions and had started bringing them. "I've been thinking about Malfoy," Hermione said, sitting down with her own stack from yesterday. She accepted a piece of Ron's toast without looking at it. "His father is Lucius Malfoy." "Yes," Harry said. "Who was a Death Eater, or adjacent to it, or has very good lawyers." She organized her books with the efficiency of someone who has a system. "There are 3 tracking curses in your signature that Dumbledore identified as consistent with former Death Eaters in Azkaban. But Lucius Malfoy isn't in Azkaban." "No," Harry agreed. "Does that mean his signature wouldn't match the known Azkaban ones?" Or he was careful," Harry said. "Used a different technique for his, assuming he placed any. Or had someone place them on his behalf." "Draco watches you," Hermione said. She was not looking at Harry when she said it, she was looking at her book, which was the specific method of someone delivering information that needs to be delivered but doesn't require a production. "Since Monday. At every meal, in the corridors. Not obviously. But consistently." "I know," Harry said. "His father told him to." Ron ate a piece of toast. "What does Lucius Malfoy want with you?" "That depends on which category he falls into," Harry said. "If he's maintaining one of the known Death Eater curses, He wants to track my magical development, same as the Voldemort fragment. If he's in the unknown 12, he wants something more specific. Something that required proximity and deep embedding and a technique sophisticated enough to evade Dumbledore's analysis. He came to Hogwarts once before, Ron said. I heard Dad mention it. 2 years ago, some Board of Governors thing. He was on the board for years. He paused. He donated a lot of money. So he has a standing reason to visit, Hermione said. And we'll have again, Harry said. He'd been waiting for this particular piece to land. McGonagall mentioned in passing on Wednesday that there's a board inspection scheduled for October. Hermione and Ron both looked at him. Lucius Malfoy will be here, Harry said. In this castle. Within range. Within range for what? Ron said carefully. For me to look at his magical signature directly and compare it to the curse signatures I can feel. Harry looked at the expression on Ron's face and Hermione's. I can feel the curses from the inside. That's not common, it's the deep embedding, actually, it's so thorough that I've been able to map the construction architecture from the inside for 2 years. If I get close enough to someone who placed one of them, I'll know. Hermione was staring at him. You can identify curse placers by feel. If they're this deeply embedded? Yes. It's like, he considered how to explain it, recognizing a voice in handwriting. The construction has a style. A maker's signature in the technique even when the maker's magical signature has been scrubbed. That's remarkable, Hermione said. That's terrifying, Ron said, and then, no, I mean it's useful. But it's also terrifying. It's both, Harry agreed. He was about to say something else when the library door opened and Neville came in, which wasn't unusual. Neville used the library on Saturdays for herbology reading, but the expression on his face was, because it wasn't the quiet, internal-facing expression he usually wore. He was looking at something he was carrying. A letter. He'd been reading a letter and he'd come to find Harry specifically, and it was visible in the way he moved, navigating the shelves without looking, following some internal sense of where Harry would be. Neville, Harry said. Neville looked up. He held out the letter. This came with the Morning Post. It's for you. He paused. My name's on the outside but it says for Harry Potter, care of Neville Longbottom. I've never gotten a letter like that. I didn't know that was possible. Harry took it. Same unmarked paper as before. Same ink. He opened it. He is coming sooner than the board inspection. He requested a private meeting with Dumbledore 2 days ago. He will arrive Wednesday. He will ask to see you. Dumbledore will try to prevent it. Don't be prevented. And below that, one additional line that hadn't been in the first letter, the technique used on the 7 deepest curses was developed by a woman who should not have been able to access you. Ask yourself who came to see your aunt in the summer of 1986. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it and looked up at the 3 of them, Hermione and Ron from the table, Neville standing with his hands in his pockets, unsure if he was supposed to still be there. Sit down, Neville, Harry said. You should probably hear this. Neville sat. Harry looked at the folded letter. Summer of 1986. He had been 6. He remembered, barely, the memory was from an age before he'd been paying close attention, a woman at the Dursleys' door. Not the kind of people who usually came to the Dursleys' door. Elegant. Dark-haired. Petunia had gone pale when she opened the door and the woman had smiled the specific smile of someone who knew they were alarming and didn't mind. She'd come inside. Harry had been made to go upstairs. He'd been 6. He hadn't had vocabulary for it. He remembered the feeling of her magic, though, sharp and cool and precise, like surgical instruments. Her name is Isolde Vane, Harry said. She came to my aunt's house when I was 6 years old. I think she was checking her work. Nobody spoke for a moment. She knows you're trying to identify her, Hermione said slowly. And she's giving you information to do it. She's giving me a controlled amount of information, Harry said. The question is what she wants in exchange. He looked at the letter again. And she says Lucius Malfoy is coming Wednesday. Not the inspection. A private visit. He paused. Dumbledore will try to keep me away from him. You're going to meet him anyway, Ron said. It wasn't a question. I need to know if his signature matches any of the 12, Harry said. If it does, I know what he is. If it doesn't, I know what he isn't. How do you get close enough without? Hermione started. Hogwarts has corridors, Harry said. They all lead somewhere. And most adults don't pay attention to first years unless there's a reason to. Neville had been very quiet through all of this. He was looking at Harry with the expression he'd had in Transfiguration, that specific expression of someone watching something they'd needed to see for a very long time and hadn't known they were waiting for it. Harry, he said. Yeah. My parents, he stopped. Started again. My parents were hurt by people like this. People who thought they could use other people for their own purposes. For information. His voice was even but his hands weren't quite. I know you probably don't need, I know about your parents, Harry said, not unkindly. I'd like your help. If you want to give it. Neville looked at him for a moment. What can I do? Wednesday afternoon, I need someone who knows the castle better than I do to identify the fastest route between the second-floor corridor and the entrance hall that avoids the main staircases. Harry paused. I've been mapping the castle but I've only been here a week. Neville straightened very slightly. I've been here 4 times, he said. Before this year. My gran brought me. I know most of the castle. He paused. The portrait on the second floor, the one of the 4 monks, there's a passage behind it that comes out in a closet next to the entrance hall. Nobody uses it. How do you know? Ron said. I got lost in it 3 years ago, Neville said simply. My gran found me an hour later and was furious. Harry looked at him and felt something that was not quite what he'd felt when Hermione had extended her hand and not quite what he'd felt when Ron had said after dinner, then, but that was in the same family. The feeling of people choosing to be in the room. Good, he said. Thank you. Hermione was already drawing a map. Wednesday came with cloud and wind and the smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet but was planning to, and after lunch Harry positioned himself in the second-floor corridor with the specific arrangement of appearing to be going somewhere rather than waiting, because waiting was visible and going somewhere was furniture. Lucius Malfoy arrived at 12:30. Harry heard him before he saw him, the sound of expensive shoes on stone, the particular cadence of someone who had never needed to make themselves quieter and had long since stopped trying. He appeared at the end of the corridor in the company of Dumbledore and McGonagall, who was walking with the precise posture of someone who has been told to be present and is choosing how to interpret that instruction. Lucius Malfoy was tall, pale, blonde, and wore the expression of someone who lived at a consistent level of disdain so familiar it had become his resting face. He was carrying a walking stick with a silver handle shaped like a serpent, which was on the long list of things Harry found inadvisable to carry if one was trying to avoid looking like a dark wizard, but which presumably Malfoy felt unconcerned about. He saw Harry in the corridor and stopped. Not because Harry had stepped in front of him. Harry hadn't moved at all. Harry was standing at the edge of the corridor looking at a portrait of the 4 monks with his hands in his pockets, and Lucius Malfoy stopped anyway because he had, Harry suspected, been told to look for Harry Potter and found him slightly sooner than expected. Harry, Dumbledore said, with the tone of someone who was calculating options at speed, shouldn't you be at, free period, Harry said. He turned and looked at Lucius Malfoy with the same directness he'd applied to everyone else this week, and the moment he was facing him fully he felt it, the specific resonance of the deep embedded curses responding to their maker's proximity, a frequency shift in the architecture of 7 of the 12 unknowns. 7. Lucius Malfoy had placed 7 of the 12 unknown tracking curses. He felt the information settle in him like a stone finding bottom in deep water. His face showed nothing. Mr. Malfoy, Harry said. Lucius Malfoy looked at him with an expression that was carefully assembled from several pieces: condescension, calculation, something that was trying to look like warmth and wasn't quite getting there. Harry Potter, he said. I must say, you're quite different from what I expected. What did you expect? Harry said. A slight pause. A boy who doesn't know what he is. And what am I? Another pause, different quality. Malfoy had expected deference, or confusion, or fear, the standard first-year toolkit for an 11-year-old facing a powerful adult. Harry had given him none of them, and the absence was making Malfoy recalibrate, which was visible in the very slight working of his jaw. The most significant magical individual born in the last century, Malfoy said, with the smoothness of someone delivering a prepared line. That's generous, Harry said. Was there something specific you wanted, or were you hoping I'd just happen to be in the corridor? Dumbledore, behind Malfoy, went completely still. Malfoy smiled. It was the smile of someone whose smile had been made into a weapon by decades of practice. I came to speak with the headmaster. Your presence is a pleasant surprise. I'm sure, Harry said. He let the moment sit for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be noticed, short enough to not be confrontational, and then he looked at Dumbledore. I won't keep you. I was just on my way to the library. He looked back at Malfoy. It was interesting to meet you. He walked past them, past Malfoy, past McGonagall whose expression was doing something complicated in his peripheral vision, past Dumbledore who was watching him with the look of someone who was very much going to want a conversation later. He went around the corner and kept walking. 7. Lucius Malfoy had embedded 7 tracking curses into his magical core. Not the fragment of Voldemort's consciousness, those were the other 5 unknowns, or some of them, but Lucius himself. Which meant Lucius Malfoy had been at the Dursleys' house. Had been near Harry. Had accessed him. The summer of 1986. A dark-haired woman at the door. But the letter had said 7 deepest curses were placed by a woman who should not have been able to access you. Isolde Vane's technique, but whose magic? The technique and the caster weren't the same person. Isolde Vane had developed the deep embedding method. Lucius Malfoy had used it. Harry turned a corner and found Hermione waiting at the entrance to the portrait passage, which meant she had positioned herself based on timing, which meant she'd been tracking his movements as precisely as he'd been tracking Malfoy's. Well, she said. 7 of the 12 are Malfoy's. Her eyes widened. The other 5, Harry said, I still can't identify. But I know the technique is Isolde Vane's work. Which means Malfoy used her method. Which means at some point, Lucius Malfoy and Isolde Vane cooperated on something. Hermione absorbed this. That's a connection between the visible threat and the invisible one. Yes, Harry said. Ron appeared from further down the corridor, slightly out of breath. How did it go? Malfoy placed 7 of the 12, Harry said. Ron's face went through several things. You could tell. Just from being near him. The curses respond to proximity with their maker. Like tuning forks. He started walking. I need to write to Gringotts today. I need to know if Malfoy has any registered magical instruments associated with my vaults or my person. If he used deep embedding he'd have needed a construction medium, an object he used as an anchor for the technique. Gringotts would have a record of anything that was registered. And if it's not registered? Hermione said, keeping pace. Then it was hidden deliberately, Harry said. And that's a different kind of useful. Neville fell in beside them as they rounded the corner toward the library, having materialized from somewhere with his herbology book under his arm and a look of someone who had been hovering in the vicinity and was now making a decision. Did the passage work? He asked. I didn't need it, Harry said. He was already in the corridor. But knowing it's there is useful. Thank you, Neville. Neville nodded once, and kept walking with them, and didn't say anything else, and Harry thought, that's 4, then. For people who knew what he was doing. For people who'd chosen to be in the room. The castle moved around them, its ancient magic pressing warmly against his skin, and the weight of the 37 curses sat in him as it always did, present, familiar, the constant companion of his entire existence. But for the first time in 10 years it felt like something that was going to change. Not because someone was changing it for him. Because he was going to change it himself. He pushed open the library door. Chapter 4, What the Founders Left. The Gringotts' reply came on Thursday morning, carried by a barn owl that landed on the Gryffindor table with the particular authority of a bird that knew its correspondence was important and felt everyone else should know it too. Harry opened it while Ron was still staring at the owl, which was wearing a small brass ring on its leg with the Gringotts seal embossed on it and evidently considered itself above ordinary owl behavior. The letter was long, dense, and written in the formal copperplate of Goblin official correspondence, which meant every sentence carried 3 times the information of normal writing because Goblins considered verbal economy a professional virtue. He read it carefully, twice, while Hermione ate her toast and waited with the composure of someone who had decided that asking questions before Harry finished reading was inefficient. The relevant sections were these. Gringotts held records of 17 magical instruments that had been registered in connection with the Potter vaults since 1981. Of those 17, 3 had been registered by parties other than the Potter account manager and had subsequently been flagged as irregular by the Goblin Auditing Department in 1989, when the department had conducted its triennial review. The 3 instruments were described as anchoring constructs of the deep embedding class, which was the first time Harry had seen that phrase in official documentation, and they had been registered under a proxy name, one Elias Morven, who upon investigation turned out to be a deceased ministerial clerk whose identity had been used fraudulently. The letter concluded, Gringotts is prepared to offer the following in the interests of resolving the matter of the irregular instruments and the associated enchantments, an appointment with Senior Cursebreaker Ragnarok, available at the Hogsmeade branch on the first available Hogsmeade weekend, at which time a full diagnostic of the affected party's magical signature may be conducted and the anchoring constructs identified and discussed. Gringotts notes that the removal of deep-embedded instruments of this class requires the physical destruction of the anchoring constructs and the willing cooperation of the affected party. Gringotts further notes that it has filed a formal complaint with the Ministry of Magic regarding the fraudulent registration and expects a response within 30 days. Anchoring constructs, Hermione said. She had been reading over his shoulder for the last paragraph and a half, which he'd noticed and allowed. So there are physical objects. Somewhere out there, Malfoy has 3 objects that are helping maintain the deep embedding. Which means the curses aren't just running on intent, Harry said. They're tied to objects. External power source. He folded the letter. If the objects are destroyed, the 7 curses collapse, Hermione finished. At minimum. Possibly the construction weakens the other 5 as well, if they're using similar architecture. Ron had stopped staring at the owl, which had taken a piece of his bacon without permission and departed. So you need to find the objects and destroy them. Or have Gringotts locate them officially, which triggers a legal process that Malfoy can fight for years, Harry said. Or find them myself and deal with them directly. Ron looked at him. How would you even, same way as the curse-placer identification. The anchoring constructs would resonate with the curses the same way Malfoy did when I was near him. If I'm close enough to the objects, I'll feel them. You need to be near Malfoy's possessions, Hermione said. Or somewhere he keeps things. His house, Ron said. Eventually, Harry agreed. Not today. He put the letter away and picked up his pumpkin juice and let the morning settle back into the noise and movement of breakfast, and he thought about the second part of the Gringotts letter. The removal of deep-embedded instruments of this class requires the physical destruction of the anchoring constructs and the willing cooperation of the affected party. The willing cooperation. Which meant the curses couldn't be removed against his will, which meant no one had been able to remove them without his knowledge, because he would have known, he would have felt the attempt, and the curses were built to resist external removal. Deep embedding was designed exactly for this. It made the curse and the person so interpenetrated that the person's own magical resistance protected the curse. He'd been protecting them without knowing it for 10 years. He sat with the specific unpleasantness of that for a moment and then let it go, because it wasn't useful to stay with it. First Hogsmeade weekend, Hermione said. When is that? Not until third year, Ron said gloomily. First years can't go to Hogsmeade. Then I write to Gringotts and ask Ragnar to come to the school. Harry set down his juice. Gringotts can conduct business outside their branches. Senior cursebreakers have done site visits before, I read about it in the account terms. The clause is there for high-value account holders who can't travel. You think they'd come to Hogwarts? Ron said. Gringotts just filed a formal ministry complaint on my behalf, Harry said. I think they consider this a high-value situation. Hermione was already writing the response letter, because of course she was, with the focused speed of someone who had been waiting for a task to perform. That afternoon was a Friday, and Friday afternoons in the first week of term had a loose quality, not quite weekend, not quite week, the school finding its pace, and Harry had a free period before dinner that he'd been using for library time. He was in the stacks, for shelves deep into the section on foundational magic, looking for anything on pre-Hogwarts enchantment architecture, when he found the gap. It wasn't obvious. It was the sort of thing you'd only notice if you were paying close attention to the physical arrangement of books, which Harry did because paying close attention to physical arrangements was how he moved through the world. The shelf was old, older than most, the wood dark and dense in a way that the newer shelves weren't, and the books on it were a specific kind of old that meant they weren't being shelved by Madame Pance's usual system but by some older organizational logic he couldn't immediately read. The gap was between two books that had been shelved at an angle, leaning toward each other over an empty space, like a V pointing down. The space between them was about 6 inches wide. Behind the space, the back of the shelf was not the wooden board he expected. It was stone. And the stone had a seam in it that was not a crack but a join, deliberate, fitted, the kind of masonry that was built to move. He pulled both angled books out carefully and set them aside. The stone was clearer now, roughly 2 feet wide, 1.5 feet tall, sitting flush with the surrounding shelf back. He put his fingers on the seam and felt the magic in it immediately. Old. Layered. Not Hogwarts ambient magic, he could distinguish that now, he'd been feeling it for a week, but something underneath it. Something that Hogwarts had been built on top of, or built around. He pressed on the left edge of the stone panel. Nothing. The right edge. Nothing. He stepped back and looked at it and thought about what he knew about foundational magic, which was the specific kind of enchantment that Hogwarts ran on, not spells applied to a structure but magic woven into the construction itself, part of the building's bones. He put his palm flat in the center of the stone and pushed his own magic into it, not a spell, not a specific intent, just, himself. His signature. The same natural magic that had been the first thing the hat felt when it touched his head. The stone moved inward with the quiet, considered motion of something that had been waiting to be opened by the right person. Behind it, stairs going down, lit by the same sourceless amber light that lit some of the older castle corridors, and the smell of deep stone and something else, something resinous and alive, the smell of very old magic that was still running, still warm, the way a fire's embers smell after the flame is gone. Harry looked at the stairs. Then back at the library. Madame Pance was 3 sections over, he could hear her occasional movements. The other students at their tables. The ordinary Friday afternoon sounds of Hogwarts. He went down. The stairs were 12 steps and ended in a room. Not a chamber in the dungeon sense, not Snape's cold stone potions classroom or the crypt quality of the lower corridors. This room was warm, or felt warm, in the way of spaces that have contained human intent for so long that the intention itself has become a kind of thermal property. It was roughly circular, the ceiling low and arched, the walls lined with not shelves but arrays, concentric circles carved into the stone, each circle containing a sequence of runes that Harry recognized fragments of but not all. At the center of the room was a stone basin, waist-high, dry now but clearly designed to contain liquid, and above the basin, suspended in the air by nothing visible, was a single disc of metal about the size of a dinner plate, covered in the same runic script as the walls. Harry stood in the entrance of the room and looked at all of it and felt the magic pressing against him like warm water. It was not hostile. It was not welcoming in the ordinary sense. It was attentive. The room was paying attention to him the way old things paid attention to things that were interesting. He walked to the basin. The disc above it rotated slowly when he approached, not in response to him, just continuously, slowly, the way planets move, as though it had been doing it for 1,000 years and saw no reason to stop. The runes on it were finer than the wall runes, and some of them he recognized from the curse composition text Hermione had found. Counter-curse arrays. Specifically, counter-curse arrays designed for layered, multi-source, deeply embedded enchantments. He looked at the disc for a long time. Then he looked at the walls. In the section of the array nearest to him, he could read enough to understand the operational principle. This room was designed to work with the caster's own magical signature as the primary tool, using the target's natural magic as the solvent for the embedded curses. It was effectively what he'd been trying to do manually, the painstaking identification work he and Hermione had been doing in the library above, but built into a physical array that would amplify and systematize the process. This room was built for exactly his problem. He stood there for another moment with that. The specific, slightly vertiginous feeling of something that has existed before you had a name for what you needed. He went back up. He found Hermione in the library stacks where he'd left her, deep in a text on curse theory, and said quietly, "Come with me." She looked up. Read his face. Set a bookmark in her page with the precision of someone who always kept their place and stood without asking questions, which was, he was beginning to understand, what Hermione Granger did when she trusted that the reason would be sufficient. They went through the stacks and he showed her the gap and the stone and she looked at it for a long moment. "How did you find this?" "The books were shelved wrong." She looked at him sideways. "I know how that sounds," he said. She pressed her own palm to the stone, and nothing happened, and she looked at Harry. "It opened for you. My magical signature. I think it's keyed to, it recognized something." He paused. "Come down. You'll see." They went down together and Hermione stood in the entrance of the room and was, for approximately 4 seconds, completely silent, which was the longest Harry had heard Hermione Granger be silent since he'd met her. "This predates the school," she said. "Yes. The architecture, these wall arrays." She moved to the nearest wall and leaned close to the runes with the focused intensity of someone reading in a language they know fragments of. "This is pre-Hogwarts. Pre-medieval, even. Some of these rune forms," she traced one gently with her finger, "I've only seen these in books that call them proto-runic. Before the standardization of runic magical script in the 9th century. "Slytherin," Harry said. She turned. "The school was founded in the late 10th century," he said. "But the founders didn't build on empty land. The site was already here. Already significant." He looked at the walls. Salazar Slytherin was the one most interested in blood and lineage and the specificity of magical signatures. The Room of Requirement is attributed to the founders. The Chamber of Secrets is Slytherin's. This, he gestured at the arrays, the disc, the basin, this is older than the chamber. This was already here when he built on top of it. But he understood it. He added to it. "How do you know it was him?" Hermione said. Harry pointed to a section of the wall array, a section he'd noticed when he first circled the room, a later addition, the rune style slightly different, the carving slightly less ancient. In the center of that section was a symbol he'd seen twice before, once in a book on wizarding heraldry and once, smaller, on the back cover of the potions textbook, in the section that attributed the founding of the school. A serpent, stylized, forming a circle by consuming its own tail. "Ouroboros," Hermione said quietly. "Slytherin's personal symbol." He annotated the array, Harry said. "Added to it. Improved it, maybe. The original construction, whatever it was, he understood what it was for and he built on it. And then he left it here. Under the library. Under the library he built, Hermione said. The original Hogwarts library was his. Harry hadn't known that. He found it interesting in a way he was going to come back to. The room responds to magical signatures. That's the whole point of the array, it works with the specific person's magic, uses their own signature as the tool. Anyone with the right kind of magical attunement can open the door. But it opened for you specifically. My signature is unusual, Harry said. The deep embedding has been part of my magical signature for 10 years. This array is specifically designed for layered, deeply embedded curse work. It recognized what I'm carrying the way a specific tool recognizes the specific work it was built for. Hermione was very still, looking at the spinning disk above the basin. Harry, she said. This could remove them. Yes. The 12. The 7 Malfoy ones and the 5 unknowns. I think so. I think this is what it's for. She turned to him. Her expression was doing several things at once in the way her expressions often did when she was working through implications at speed. Have you told Dumbledore? No. Are you going to? Harry looked at the room, the warm amber light, the patient runes, the slow rotation of the disk above the basin. He thought about the morning in Dumbledore's office, the careful partial explanations, the 3-order tracking curses removed with appropriate care. He thought about I have had some version of this theory for several years but I didn't tell you. Eventually, he said. After I understand it well enough to know what he'd do with the information. Hermione looked at him for a moment, not judging, processing. You don't trust him yet. I trust him to care, Harry said. I don't yet trust him not to manage. Those are different things. He looked at the disk. If he knows about this room, he might take over the process. Bring in specialists. Build a plan. Make it something that happens to me rather than something I do. He paused. I've had enough of things happening to me. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the decisive quality she had when she'd reached a conclusion she intended to act on. I want to understand the arrays, she said. Before anything happens in here, I want to know what every rune does. I hoped you'd say that. It'll take time. Some of these rune forms aren't in any text I've found yet. We'll find the texts, Harry said. That's what the library is for. She smiled briefly, and it was the smile of someone who found that answer fundamentally correct. Then she turned back to the wall and started reading. They brought Ron down that evening. His reaction was different from Hermione's, less academic, more immediate, a kind of physical alertness that spread through him as he walked into the room and felt the warmth of it. He stood in the center and turned slowly and said, "This feels like something important." "It is," Harry said. "Like, really old important. Like the castle doesn't know this is here." Harry considered that. "I think the castle knows," he said. "I think the castle has always known. But it's not part of the school's operational magic. It's underneath it. Pre-existing. The castle built itself around this the way a river builds itself around a rock. The rock is there, the river goes around it, neither one cancels the other." Ron walked to the basin and looked down into it. "What goes in here?" "I don't know yet," Hermione said from the wall, where she had been cataloging runes for 2 hours with a parchment and quill. "But the array suggests a medium, the removal process works through the basin. Something liquid, probably, something that conducts magical signature clearly. Water? Something more specific." She tapped a rune sequence. "This group here, these are associated with clarity and revelation in the runic texts I have access to. Something that strips interference, removes static, lets the signature run clean." She paused. "I think I know what it is but I need to confirm it." "What do you think it is?" Harry said. "Pensive liquid," she said. "Or something similar, a substance designed to hold magical thought and memory in physical form." The arrays amplify the target's own magical signature and the medium provides the surface for the curse architecture to precipitate out. She was moving along the wall as she talked, reading and writing simultaneously. It's like, when you dissolve something in liquid and then cool it, the impurities crystallize out. This is that, but for embedded curses. You run your signature through the medium, the curses can't follow because they're not native to you, they're foreign bodies, Harry said. Exactly. The deep embedding makes them feel native but they're not. This array is sensitive enough to tell the difference. She stopped at a section of the wall and turned. Harry. This section, the annotated part, Slytherin's additions, I think these are instructions. I think I can read most of them. She read them to him in fragments, working out the translation as she went, and Harry listened and built the picture. The person whose signature had been compromised stands in the center. The disc above the basin is attuned to their magical core, it does this automatically, that was the original construction, it reads the person and adjusts. The basin is filled. The person allows their magic to run through the basin's medium, and the medium catalyzes the separation. The curses precipitate out as visible structures, physical form, and from there can be broken. It's not instant, Hermione said. And it's not passive. The person doing it has to actively push their magic through. It requires intention. Commitment. It requires cooperation, Harry said. The willing cooperation of the affected party, Hermione quoted. Same language as the Gringotts letter. This technique is what Gringotts cursebreakers would use, Harry said. Not this specific room, but the same principle. The goblin-built removal arrays work on the same foundational theory. Slytherin understood this before goblins formalized it, Hermione said quietly. Or learned it from the same source, Harry said. Goblin magic and early wizarding foundational magic have overlapping roots. It's in the history books if you read carefully. He looked at the basin. How long does the process take? For 40 curses, well, 37 now, this scale of embedded work. She looked at her notes. The array instructions mention a duration scaling with complexity. The deepest embedded curses would take the longest. She did something quick with numbers in her head. Hours, probably. Not minutes. The person would need to be here for a sustained period. Can it be done in stages? Harry said. I think so. I don't see anything that requires it to be completed in one session. The basin can be refilled. The array stays attuned to the person's signature between sessions as long as they don't go more than, she checked her notes, 3 days between sessions. Harry nodded. We'll need the basin medium. I'll find it, Hermione said, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never failed to find something in a library and saw no reason to start now. How long until you've fully translated the instructions? Give me a week. You have a week, Harry said. Ron. Ron looked up from where he'd been examining the Ouroboros symbol on the wall. Can you find out what Malfoy's visit accomplished? Whatever he and Dumbledore discussed, there'll be talk. His son will know something. Ron made a face. I'm not exactly Malfoy's friend. You don't need to be his friend. You need to be in the same room as him when he's telling Crabbe and Goyle about it. Ron considered this. Draco Malfoy, Harry continued, is 11 years old and his father just visited and he will absolutely tell his friends what his father came here for, because that's what 11-year-olds do when their fathers do something impressive. Ron's mouth quirked. He'll be insufferable about it. Probably. Right, Ron said. I'll be near him at dinner. I'll be near him a lot. He paused. I can do that. I'll just imagine he's Fred when Fred is being annoying. That's the spirit, Harry said. The week moved. Classes found their rhythms. Charms with Flitwick, who was so genuinely delighted by magic that his delight was contagious, Harry found himself actually smiling during the levitation lesson, which was rare enough for him to notice. Flitwick said Wingardium Leviosa with the joy of someone saying it for the first time, every time, and Harry thought that was either a performance or a genuine relationship with wonder, and he wasn't sure which was more admirable. Hermione got her feather to rise first. Harry's rose at the same time. They looked at each other's feathers, then at each other, and Hermione said, "I used the wrist movement," and Harry said, "I just asked," and Flitwick, who overheard both, made a sound that was half giggle and half professional appreciation. Ron's took longer, which frustrated him until he stopped watching Harry and Hermione's and focused on his own, and then it went up with the decisive authority of something that had been waiting for his full attention. Neville's feather rose and then kept going, sailed over the heads of the other students, and hit the ceiling with a soft pat. Flitwick said, "Extraordinary force, Mr. Longbottom," and Neville looked startled and then quietly, privately pleased in the way that was becoming his signature expression when magic went right. At dinner that Thursday Ron appeared beside Harry with a plate and a specific expression, the expression of someone who has been doing good intelligence work and knows it. He waited until the noise level was high enough and said, quietly, "Malfoy came to request access to Hogwarts student records." Harry kept eating. "What kind of records?" "Current student enrollment, specifically. Who's here, in what houses, with what scores from the sorting." Ron speared something with his fork. Draco told Crabbe that his father wanted to know which new students might be worth his attention. I'm quoting. "Worth his attention. He's building an asset list," Harry said. Dumbledore said no. Apparently very firmly, which Draco said like it surprised him. Ron lowered his voice further. And then Draco said, he said his father was especially interested in specific students. Plural. But he kept saying that Potter boy with this, he made the face of someone making a particular face, this specific look. "He wanted Dumbledore to arrange a meeting with me," Harry said. "I think so, yeah." Dumbledore refused. "Definitely." Draco was annoyed about it because he thought meeting you might. "I think he'd been looking forward to doing something impressive in front of you, actually. He wants you to think well of him, in this particular possessive way. He wants to be on the right side of me before his father is," Harry said. "He's smart enough to know his father's approach isn't subtle." Ron looked at him. "You figured that out just from, Draco Malfoy has been watching me all week," Harry said. "He watches everyone who's watching me. He's mapping the social landscape around me before his father decides how to use it." He paused. "He's not a bad observer." "He's awful," Ron said. "Those aren't contradictory things." Ron thought about it. "No," he said reluctantly. "I suppose they're not." Friday evening, Harry went back to the room. He went alone this time. Hermione had given him the first section of her rune translations, the activation sequence for the disc above the basin, and he wanted to test something. Not the full removal process. Just a reading. Just to understand what the disc could see. He stood in the center of the room, below the slowly rotating disc, and let his magic run loose in the way he almost never did. He kept it controlled habitually, had learned to keep it controlled because uncontrolled accidental magic had consequences at the Dursleys that he preferred to avoid. But here the room absorbed it easily, the arrays receiving the excess without resistance, and the disc above the basin shifted. Not in rotation speed, it kept its slow pace, but in the quality of light it cast. It had been giving off the same warm amber as the room. Now it moved through a specific spectrum, narrowing, and the light it cast on Harry changed quality and he felt, for the first time, the curses in his signature from the outside as well as the inside. It was extraordinary. Like hearing your own heartbeat amplified. He stood there and let the disc read him and worked through what it was telling him, the way the 37 curses organized themselves in layers, the order ones were gone, he registered that confirmation with satisfaction, the ministry ones sitting at the outer level, the Azkaban Death Eater ones below those, the Malfoy-embedded 7 below those, and below all of them, the deepest layer, 5 curses that were unlike anything else, older, woven so completely into his foundational magic. That the disk was registering them at the same depth it registered his own core. The 5 deepest ones. He stood with them in the disk's light and thought about what the hat had said. One of them was placed by the same hand that cast the curse that killed your parents. And what Dumbledore had said about the soul fragment. And what the unsigned letter had hinted at, the careful controlled drip of information from someone whose identity he still hadn't confirmed but whose ink he recognized. 5 curses. Deepest layer. One from Voldemort's fragment, placed on a dying infant in Godric's Hollow. 4 others from, what? Who else had been in Godric's Hollow that night, or close enough after to place a deep embedded curse in an infant's magical core? He closed his magic back up, slowly, and the disk's light returned to warm amber. He stood in the quiet of the room and listened to the castle above him, footsteps, distant, the particular resonance of stone that had been inhabited for 1,000 years. 4 people. 4 people whose identity he didn't know, whose technique he did know, who had placed pieces of themselves in his magical core before he could walk. 4 people who were still, right now, receiving information about him. His development, his learning, every new piece of magic he worked in this school. He thought about the 5 potions questions he'd answered this week that Snape had awarded points for with visible reluctance. He thought about the transfiguration lesson where he'd turned a button into a beetle, the full transformation, not just the surface change, and McGonagall had said Mr. Potter in the tone of someone whose professional composure was doing a significant amount of work. He thought about flying, the way the broom had responded to him like a conversation. Every one of those moments, fed out through the 5 deep curses to somewhere, to someone. He didn't find that frightening. He found it useful. Because if they could receive information through the curses, he might eventually be able to send it. Not yet. Not until he understood the array well enough. But the disk had just shown him something. The deep curses were 2-way channels, not 1-way feeds. The information moved both directions in the construction, that was inherent to deep embedding. It had to be, the curse integrated so fully with the person's magic that the person's magic moved both ways through the link. Which meant the 5 people on the other end weren't just watching him. They were, in a very specific technical sense, also reachable. He filed that away, very carefully, in the most secure architecture of his mind. The occlumency work he'd done from the damaged library book had given him internal structure. He thought of his memory as a house, rooms and corridors, things stored where he could find them. He put this particular piece of information in the deepest room of that house and closed the door. Not yet. But eventually. He went back up the stairs and slid the stone panel closed and rearranged the leaning books over it and walked back into the library. Hermione looked up from her work and looked at his face and said, "You found something new." "Yes," Harry said. "Good new or complicated new?" Harry sat down. He thought about a room that had been waiting under a library for longer than Hogwarts had existed, and an array that could read the architecture of his stolen childhood back to him in light and runes, and 5 channels running deep in his magical core to 5 unknown people who had been watching him grow up. "Both," he said. Hermione pushed a stack of translated notes toward him. "Sit down. Tell me." He sat down. He told her. Above them the library closed for the evening, Madame Pants moving through the stacks with her lamp, and the candles guttered down, and the castle settled into its night sounds, and below the oldest section of the shelves the room waited, warm and patient and ancient, the disk rotating above the dry basin with the unhurried certainty of something that had been doing exactly this for a very long time and would keep doing it until the work was finally, properly done. Chapter 5, Isolde. The second unsigned letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into term, tucked inside Harry's copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi when he opened it for herbology prep. Not delivered by owl. Not slipped under a door. Just there, between pages 42 and 43, as though it had always been there and the book had simply been waiting for the right moment to show him. He read it under the table while Professor Sprout talked about the properties of Devil's Snare. "You found the room. Good. Don't use the basin until you've spoken with me. There are things about the 5 deep curses that the array cannot tell you and that Dumbledore does not know. I will find you Saturday morning. The East Courtyard, 7 o'clock, before the castle wakes. Come alone. No signature. Same ink. Same handwriting, controlled and precise and faintly familiar in the way of a voice heard through walls. You know the voice, you can't quite place it. Harry put the letter in his robes and looked up at Professor Sprout, who was demonstrating how Devil's Snare responded to light with the enthusiasm of someone who had loved plants since before she could name them, and he thought about 7 o'clock Saturday and the East Courtyard and the word alone and whether he was going to honor it. He decided he was, with modifications. The modifications being, Hermione would know where he was going and at what time and would come looking if he wasn't back in an hour. This wasn't the same as not being alone. This was being alone with a contingency plan, which was different and better. He passed the letter to Hermione in the corridor between herbology and charms. She read it while walking, which was very Hermione, and handed it back. 7 curses are Malfoy's, she said quietly. 5 unknowns. She's offering to explain the 5. Yes. Which means she knows who placed them. Or she placed them herself, Harry said. Hermione didn't flinch at that. And you're going? Yes. Because she's been accurate so far. And because I want to look at her directly, Harry said. The same way I looked at Malfoy. If she's placed any of the 5, I'll know. And if she's placed all 5? Harry thought about that. A woman who had come to his aunt's house when he was 6. Who had developed the deep embedding technique. Who had been feeding him controlled information for 3 weeks with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much to give and when. Then I want to know why, he said. And she wants me to know too. That's why she keeps writing. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Be careful. I'm always careful. You're always prepared, she said. That's slightly different. He looked at her. Fair. 1 hour, she said. If you're not back I'm coming with McGonagall. Not Dumbledore. She gave him the look. McGonagall. Agreed, he said, and they went to Charms. Saturday arrived grey and cold and very still, the kind of morning that felt withheld, like weather that was thinking about what it wanted to do and hadn't decided yet. Harry was up at 6, dressed and out of the common room by 10 past, moving through the castle in the particular way he developed over 3 weeks of learning its rhythms, staying where the traffic would be if there were traffic, which meant staying where he wouldn't look anomalous when the castle woke up, which at 6:15 meant the main corridors rather than the secret ones. He'd mapped most of the secret ones anyway. The East Courtyard was a small square of flagstone between the Transfiguration classroom wing and the outer wall, open to the sky but sheltered on 3 sides, with a stone bench along the east wall and a dead fountain in the center that had stopped working sometime in the last century and now grew a specific kind of moss that Hermione had identified as having counter-jinx properties. Harry had been here twice before, once to think and once because Neville had found an interesting beetle near the fountain that turned out to be, on closer inspection, an interesting beetle rather than a transfiguration exercise. He arrived at 5 to 7 and sat on the bench and waited. She came from the outer wall. Not through a door, he'd been watching all 3 doors. She came from the outer wall itself, stepping through it with the casual ease of someone who had used that particular passage so many times it had become a habit. She was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in her late 30s, wearing traveling robes that were the specific shade of dark blue that blended with pre-dawn shadow. She had the precise, unhurried movement of someone who had spent a very long time being careful and was now choosing not to be, which was itself a kind of message. She stopped 6 feet from him and looked at him. He looked back. He felt the curses respond immediately, the 5 deep ones, resonating with the frequency shift he'd learned to recognize over the past weeks. The same resonance as Malfoy but different in quality, where Malfoy's construction had felt like architectural work, precise and deliberate, hers felt like understanding. Not just technical proficiency. Genuine comprehension of what she was doing at the level of the magic itself. 2 of the 5 were hers. He filed that and kept his face neutral. Harry Potter, she said, and her voice was low and very even. "Isolde Vane," he said. She didn't react to being named. She'd expected it. "You felt them when I came through the wall." "Two," he said. "The second and the fourth deepest." She looked at him steadily. "You can differentiate individual curses by depth." "Since I was 9. Roughly." "Roughly," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite admiration but was related to it. She moved to the other end of the bench and sat at the opposite end, which was a choice that maintained distance without creating hostility. "You're better at this than I expected. How long have you been watching me?" "Since Godric's Hollow," she said. "Not continuously. But consistently. Through the curses. Through the curses. And through other methods." She looked at the dead fountain. "The first letter I sent you was in September. Before that I watched through the embedding." She paused. "I was at Godric's Hollow the night your parents died." Harry was quiet. He'd been expecting something like this: the timing of the deep curses, the proximity requirement of deep embedding, the way the anonymous information had come with the specific authority of an eyewitness. But hearing it said directly hit differently from working it out in theory, and he sat with the impact of it for a moment without trying to process it away. "Why?" he said. "Because Albus Dumbledore had been given intelligence that Voldemort had identified a prophecy child, and he had not told enough people, and I had a source that told me the Potter's location had been compromised." She said it evenly, without drama, the way people talked about things that had become too old and heavy to carry with emotion anymore. "I arrived 20 minutes after it was over. Your parents were dead. You were alive. The house was destroyed. And you were lying in the rubble, and your magical signature was extraordinary and wrong simultaneously, because the curse had done something to you that I had never seen done to a living person." "The protection magic," Harry said. "More than that. The rebounded killing curse had left a fracture in the architecture of your core. Not a damage, exactly. A door that had been forced open and then half closed again. Something had been pushed through it in both directions." She looked at him. "I had been a curse researcher for 11 years at that point. I had never seen anything like it. And I understood, standing in that rubble with you crying and the house burning, that I was looking at the most magically significant thing that had happened in the last century, and that the most dangerous people in Britain were going to converge on you within hours." "So you embedded tracking curses in a baby," Harry said. "Not an accusation. An observation." "I embedded 2 monitoring constructs in a baby," she said. "Yes. Using a technique I'd developed that would make them undetectable by standard analysis. Because I still believe, that you needed watchers who weren't affiliated with Dumbledore's network or the Ministry or the remaining Death Eaters." She paused. "You needed someone watching from outside all 3 institutions." Harry looked at the dead fountain. The moss on it was very green in the grey morning light. "You watched me for 10 years. Yes. You knew I was with people who didn't care about me. I knew you were alive. I knew you were physically safe. The constructs weren't designed for emotional intelligence, they read magical health, developmental patterns, threat proximity." She stopped. "I told myself that was enough." "Was it?" A pause. "No," she said. "It wasn't." The grey morning held them for a moment. Somewhere above, a bird moved across the courtyard's rectangle of sky. "The other 3 deep curses," Harry said. "Not yours. Not Voldemort's fragment, I know about that one." "Who placed the other 2? She looked at him steadily. "You've been expecting this question to be uncomfortable. I've been expecting the answer to be complicated." "It is," she said. "One of them was placed by Peter Pettigrew." Harry felt something cold move through him that was nothing like any of the cold things he'd felt before. Not fear. Something rawer. "Pettigrew is supposed to be dead," he said. "He was the secret keeper. He betrayed my parents. Sirius Black, he stopped. Sirius Black is in Azkaban for a crime he didn't commit, Isolde Vane said. Peter Pettigrew is alive and hidden, and he placed a monitoring construct in your core the night of Godric's Hollow, before I arrived, in the same window of chaos when the other early curses were placed. She paused. He wanted to know if you lived. He has been watching you survive for 10 years with the particular misery of someone who knows what they did. The East Courtyard was very quiet. Harry worked through it. Pettigrew alive. Sirius Black innocent. His parents' secret keeper a traitor who had faked his own death and hidden for 10 years. Azkaban holding the wrong man. It was a large amount of wrongness to hold in one place, and he let it sit in his mind without trying to compress it, let it be as large as it was. And the last one, he said. His voice was still level. He was proud of that. Isolde looked at him with the expression of someone about to place a heavy object on a surface and unsure if it will hold. The last deep curse was placed by someone you'll find difficult to believe, she said. And I want you to hear the whole context before you react. Tell me. It was placed by Severus Snape. The word sat in the courtyard air and the cold morning light, and Harry looked at them the way he looked at everything, directly, without flinching away, and thought through it. Snape. Who had black eyes that gave away nothing. Who had looked at him on the first night with the assessment of someone running scenarios. Who had, over the past 3 weeks, awarded him points with the specific reluctance of someone paying a debt they resented, and who had watched Harry's potions work with an attention that was too focused to be merely professional. He was in the Order, Harry said. Yes. He knew my parents. He knew your mother, Isolde said. They were, Lily Evans and Severus Snape were friends. Before Hogwarts. Through their early years here. They became estranged in their 5th year. By the time he joined the Death Eaters she had married your father. She paused. He defected from the Death Eaters before Godric's Hollow. He gave Dumbledore information that, she stopped. He tried to warn Dumbledore. The warning came too late. Harry was still. He was at Godric's Hollow. After. Like me. But earlier than me, I arrived to find him already gone. I found traces of his magical signature and 2 monitoring constructs that were his. I believe he placed them for the same reason I did. Because he didn't trust Dumbledore to do enough. Because she stopped again. Because he loved your mother and he placed monitoring curses in her infant son without permission and then spent 10 years watching you live and presumably didn't know how to face that. The courtyard. The grey sky. The dead fountain with its moss. Harry thought about black eyes in a potions classroom. Where would you look if I told you to find me a Bezoar? The reluctance of someone who keeps paying a debt and keeps finding it unpaid. The specific quality of Snape's attention in classes, not the general assessment he gave other students but the specific, drilling focus he turned on Harry, like someone searching for something in a face they know. He's been watching me live, Harry said. Yes. Through the construct. Yes. And he knows I can feel them. He was in the hall when the hat spoke. He knows, Isolde said. He has known since September 1st that you are aware of being tracked. And he has not come to you. Because he doesn't know how, Harry said. Isolde looked at him. Not with surprise. With something that was almost respect. You're remarkably undisturbed by this, she said. I'm disturbed, Harry said. I'm just not going to let it run loose. He looked at her directly. Why are you telling me this? The controlled information drops, the letters, coming here today, what do you want from me? She met his gaze. I want to help you remove the curses. That's the charitable version, he said. The actual version. A beat of silence. Then she said, I developed deep embedding. I used it on you without permission when you were an infant and I have spent 10 years making peace with that decision and failed. I want to undo it, my 2, and the others I can help you understand. And there is a faction, her voice shifted slightly, a calibration, a group of former Death Eaters who know what I know about your magical architecture. Who know what deep embedding can do. Who want to use that knowledge in your specific situation for purposes that are not in your interest. She paused. They approached me 6 months ago. The third faction, Harry said. She looked at him sharply. I've been building a picture, he said. The Ministry faction, the remnants of Voldemort's network, and a third group. Operating differently. Wanting me alive and controlled rather than dead. Who are they? Isolde was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful in the way of someone dismantling something that might still be live. They call themselves the Architects. Former Death Eaters who concluded that Voldemort failed not because his goals were wrong but because his methods were too crude. Too visible. Too dependent on fear as a primary tool. She looked at Harry. They want a different kind of power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't announce itself. They believe that you, specifically, your magical architecture, the fracture the rebounded curse left in your core, represent an opportunity. They want to use the fracture, Harry said. They believe the fracture could be widened. Used as a conduit. That a magically sophisticated person with the right knowledge could, through the deep embedding channels already present in your core, push magic into you rather than simply reading magic out of you. She held his gaze. Effectively. They want to use the channels as a two-way bridge. To pour their intent into your magic and operate through you. The courtyard was very still. Harry let the full shape of it land. Not just tracking him. Using him. His body, his magic, his extraordinary fractured core as a vehicle for someone else's will. He thought about what he'd noticed in the room, the two-way nature of the deep channels. He'd thought of it as a potential tool. The Architects had thought of it first and thought of it as a weapon. The fracture responds to deep magic more readily than an ordinary core, Harry said. Yes. Because it was forced open and never fully healed. Yes. Can it be fully healed? That's the question Dumbledore hasn't asked, Isolde said. He knows about the fracture. He's been monitoring it. But he's been treating it as a permanent feature of your magical architecture, something to be managed, not repaired. She paused. I don't believe it's permanent. I believe the room you found under the library was built specifically for fracture repair. Harry looked at her. The basin. The basin is not primarily a curse removal instrument, Isolde said. It's a core repair instrument. The curse removal is a side effect, the primary function is reconstituting fractured magical architecture. Clearing the channels, mending the forced openings, restoring the integrity of the core. She paused. I've been researching it for 11 years. The proto-runic construction, the Slytherin annotations, the foundational principles, the room was built for exactly what happened to you. Not you specifically. But the thing that happened to you. It happened before, Harry said. Killing curses rebound if the target is protected by sacrificial magic. It's extraordinarily rare, maybe a handful of times in recorded history. The room predates written records. But someone built it for this purpose. And Slytherin, 1100 years ago, found it and understood it and annotated it. Harry thought about the warm room, the patient disc, the way it had read him from the inside out. He thought about standing in its light and feeling the curses in his signature from the outside for the first time, and underneath them, deeper than all of them, the fracture. He hadn't known to call it that, but he'd felt it, a discontinuity in the foundation of his own magic, a place where something had been forced and not properly recovered. The Architects know about the room, he said. No, Isolde said. They know about your fracture. They don't know about the room. They don't know Hogwarts has anything that could repair it. She paused. If they knew the room existed, they would want it destroyed. A repaired fracture is a closed conduit. They lose their access vector. So the room existing is a threat to them, Harry said. The room being used is, she said. If you complete the process, remove the curses, repair the fracture, the architects lose their primary interest in you. And gain a significant reason to be angry at me. Yes, she said. There is that. Harry looked at the dead fountain for a moment. He thought about timing. How many architects are there? The core group is 7. They have resources and patience and intelligence. She paused. Their leader is a man named Corban Yaxley. He was a Death Eater but never convicted. He has been inside the ministry for 10 years. Ministry side and architect side, Harry said. 2 factions that overlap. Partially, Isolde said. The rogue ministry tracking faction and the architects share some members but have different goals. The ministry people want to control you instrumentally. The architects want to use you fundamentally. The distinction matters. And Malfoy? Isolde's expression didn't change but something in her posture did. A slight adjustment, the kind that meant she was deciding how much to give. Lucius Malfoy has been in communication with the architects. He provided them with the deep embedding constructs, the 3 physical anchors, in exchange for protection and access. He's not a core member. He's a resource. He built the anchors using your technique, Harry said. He commissioned them from me, she said. Years ago. Before I understood what he intended them for. Before I understood what the architects were. A pause. That is another thing I need to undo. Harry looked at her steadily. You want to help remove the curses, repair the fracture, destroy the anchoring constructs, and neutralize the architect's access to me. Yes. In exchange for what? She looked at him without flinching. Nothing, she said. I placed monitoring constructs in an infant without permission. I sold a technique to a man who used it against you. I watched you grow up through those channels for 10 years without introducing myself. The only thing I want in exchange is the chance to do something useful with the time I have left to do it. She paused. I'm not asking you to trust me. Good, Harry said. Because I don't yet. No, she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost relief. You shouldn't. They sat in the grey Saturday morning for a moment. Why can't I use the basin before we speak? Harry said. That was in your letter. You said don't use it until I've talked to you. Because the basin's full process, the curse removal and the fracture repair, is irreversible once begun past a certain point, she said. And if you go too deep into it without knowing about the fracture, the process will try to close the forced opening and it will hurt. She paused. The process is designed to work with your cooperation and your understanding. You need to know what it's doing to every part of your core as it does it. If you don't know about the fracture and the process begins to address it, your instinct will be to resist it because it will feel like damage. And if you resist it at that stage, I could damage myself instead of healing, Harry said. Yes. He thought about that. About standing in the room with the disc above the basin reading him and feeling the deep curses and underneath them the thing he'd felt but not named. The discontinuity. Does Dumbledore know about the fracture repair possibility? He knows about the fracture. He doesn't know the room can repair it. She paused. I believe he considers the fracture integral to your nature at this point. Part of what makes you Harry Potter. I believe he has built plans around its existence. What plans? Harry said. Isolde looked at him for a long moment. There are limits to what I know, she said. But Dumbledore is a man who plans 20 years ahead. He considers you the solution to a problem that isn't finished. The problem being Voldemort's persistence, the soul fragments, the consciousness that survived. He needs the fracture to exist because he believes, I believe he believes, that only someone who carries a fracture made by Voldemort's curse can ultimately destroy what remains of Voldemort. She paused. I believe he is correct about that. I also believe it is not his choice to make. It is yours. The East Courtyard. The Grey Sky. Harry Potter on a stone bench with 11 years of life behind him and the full weight of what he was in front of him. He sat with it. He didn't try to make it smaller. He let it be exactly as large as it was. The fracture can be repaired and still be useful, he said. Healed, sealed on my terms, under my control. That's different from what Dumbledore is planning for. Isolde looked at him. Yes, she said. That is different. And the architects lose their access if it's done correctly. Yes. And Pettigrew is alive, Harry said. And Sirius Black is in Azkaban for a murder that didn't happen. Yes. That needs to change. Yes, she said. It does. Harry stood up. He was 11 years old and he was standing in a courtyard in a grey October morning, and the full shape of what the next several years of his life might look like was somewhere behind his eyes, not as fear and not as weight but as a set of problems waiting to be worked through. One after another, methodically, with good information and good people and the specific kind of patience that he'd been building since he was 7 years old, sitting in his cupboard under the stairs with a book about magic he wasn't supposed to have. I need 3 things from you, he said. First, everything you know about the fracture and the rune's process, written down in enough detail that Hermione can verify it against the rune translations. Done, Isolde said. Second, whatever evidence you have about Pettigrew being alive and Sirius Black's innocence. Isolde reached into her traveling robes and produced a sealed envelope. I prepared this before today, she said. Documents, memories in veil form, sworn testimony from a witness who was present the night Pettigrew faked his death. I've been waiting to hand it to someone who would know what to do with it. Harry took the envelope. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it in his robes next to the 2 previous letters and the Gringotts correspondence. Third, the location of the 3 anchoring constructs Malfoy built. Isolde's expression shifted, not resistance, something more like assessment. If those constructs are destroyed, Malfoy will know immediately. The magical feedback will tell him the constructs have been compromised. Good, Harry said. She looked at him. You want him to know. I want to stop managing what he knows and start managing what he does about it, Harry said. Malfoy knowing I've destroyed his constructs forces him to act. Acting people make decisions that can be read. Deciding people are invisible. He paused. Where are they? Isolde told him. Malfoy Manor, in a warded study on the 2nd floor. A carved stone box, specifically, that Malfoy kept on his desk and which appeared to be a decorative item. The 3 constructs were inside it, sealed in the box's base. I can't walk into Malfoy Manor, Harry said. No, Isolde agreed. But Draco Malfoy comes home for Christmas in 10 weeks. And Draco Malfoy has, if I've watched correctly, been establishing a complicated relationship with you since September 1st. She paused. You don't need to go to the manor. You need Draco to come to you, and you need him to bring something. Harry looked at her. You want me to use a 12-year-old as an unwitting courier. I want you to understand your options, Isolde said. What you do with them is your choice. Harry thought about Draco Malfoy watching him across the Great Hall. About Ron's assessment, he wants you to think well of him in this particular possessive way. About the flying lesson, the remembrall, the throw designed to be difficult. About a boy whose father had been using him as a surveillance asset since before term started and who was just smart enough to know it and just young enough to hate it. I won't use him without telling him, Harry said. Isolde looked at him for a long moment. That's more honest than the situation requires. Maybe, Harry said. But it's the kind of honest I'm choosing. He looked at her steadily. You put things in me without my knowledge. Malfoy's father did the same. The third faction wants to use my architecture without my consent. I'm not continuing that pattern on anyone else. He paused. Not even on someone I don't like. Isolde held his gaze. And the thing in her expression, which had been carefully composed through the whole conversation, controlled and professional, and the expression of someone who had been careful for a very long time, shifted. Not dramatically. Just a small, private shift in the quality of it. Like something settling. "No," she said quietly. "I don't suppose you are." The grey morning held. Somewhere above the castle a rook called once and went silent. "I'll need a way to contact you," Harry said. "Leave a letter in the library. In the gap where you found the room's entrance. I have access to the library through the same passage in the outer wall. I check it every 3 days." "You've been using that passage since before term started," Harry said. "The passage predates the school," she said. "It runs through the original foundation. Hogwarts was built around it." She stood. "The information about the fracture and the room will be in the gap by tomorrow morning." She walked back toward the outer wall. "Vain," Harry said. She stopped. "The 2 constructs you placed in 1981, Harry said. "When the time comes, I'll remove them through the room's process. The same as the others." He paused. "Not because I forgive you for placing them. Because removing them is my choice to make, and I want to make it on my terms." She stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she turned halfway. "I know," she said. "That's why I came." She stepped through the wall. The stone closed behind her as though she'd never been there, and the courtyard was empty except for Harry and the dead fountain and the rook calling once more from somewhere high up on the battlements. He stood for a moment. Then he reached into his robes and took stock, the Gringotts letter, the unsigned letters, the envelope Isolde had handed him. He thought about the evidence inside it. Pettigrew alive. Sirius Black innocent in Azkaban. A man his parents had trusted with their lives who had sold them for his own survival and then disappeared into hiding while an innocent man took the sentence for it. He thought about the 5 deep curses. 2 Isolde's. 1 Pettigrew's. 1 Snape's. 1 Voldemort's fragment. He thought about Snape, specifically, in the potions dungeon, awarding points with reluctant precision, watching Harry's hands on a potion with the focus of someone looking for something in a face they used to know. He was going to have to talk to Snape. That was a conversation he was going to have to think about carefully. He started back toward the castle as the first students began to filter into the corridors for breakfast, and by the time he reached the main entrance he had a version of it that might work, not the full conversation, not yet, but the opening move. "The thing you said to a man who had been watching you through a monitoring curse for 10 years and didn't know how to stop." He'd said it already, he realized. To Dumbledore, in front of 1,000 people. To Isolde in an empty courtyard. The same thing, different context. "I know." 2 words. Not forgiveness. Not accusation. Just acknowledgement, clear-eyed and steady, one person confirming they'd received another person's decade of complicated feeling. He'd figure out the rest. He went to find Hermione. She was in the common room with Ron and Neville, and she looked up when he came through the portrait hole and scanned his face with the speed she'd developed over the last 3 weeks. "You're all right," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need to tell you all something." He sat in the chair by the fire. They arranged themselves around him, Hermione curled up in the opposite chair with the focused readiness of someone turning on their full attention, Ron on the floor with his back against the chair because Ron thought better when he was physically lower than the conversation, Neville on the arm of the sofa nearest Harry with the particular attentiveness he'd been bringing to everything since the first Transfiguration lesson. Harry told them everything. All of it. Isolde, the 2 constructs, Pettigrew, Sirius Black, the architects and Yaxley, the fracture and what the room could do, the anchoring constructs at Malfoy Manor, the full picture as he now had it. He watched their faces as he talked. Hermione processed at speed, her expression moving through information the way water moved over ground, finding every contour, every implication, every angle. Ron went still in the way he went still when something made him angry, the specific stillness of someone who knew that acting on anger right now would be unhelpful and was managing it with the stubbornness of someone accustomed to managing things with stubbornness. Neville went pale at Pettigrew alive, and then something in his face hardened in a way Harry hadn't seen before, a quiet, specific hardening, like something soft finding its shape. When Harry finished, the fire was the only sound for a moment. "Sirius Black is innocent," Hermione said. "Yes. And you have evidence." He held up the envelope. She looked at it. "We need to get that to someone who can act on it. Not Dumbledore first. If Dumbledore knows, he controls the timeline." "McGonagall," Harry said. "McGonagall," she agreed. "Today." Ron said. "Today," Harry said. "Before I lose my nerve about doing it in the right order." Ron looked at him. "You don't lose your nerve." "I might about this one," Harry said. "There's a man in Azkaban who's been there for 10 years for something he didn't do. Every day I take working out the right order to address it is another day he's there." The room was quiet. "Right," Ron said. "Today." Neville, who had been very quiet through all of this, said, "What about Snape?" They all looked at him. "You said one of the deep curses is his," Neville said. "He's watching you the same way the others are. But he's here. He's your teacher. You see him 3 times a week." He paused. "And he knew your mum." "Yes," Harry said. "Are you going to talk to him?" "Yes," Harry said. "When?" Harry thought about the patience he'd spent 11 years building. About the specific, precise anger of making choices deliberately instead of reactively. About a man in a potions dungeon with black eyes and a decade of complicated feelings he'd organized into something controlled and very dark and very watchful. "When I know what to say," Harry said. "Which means after I've read everything Isolde is leaving in the library, and after I've spoken to McGonagall, and after I understand what I'm dealing with well enough to say it clearly." He paused. "But soon." Neville nodded once, satisfied with that, and looked at his hands, and said quietly, "Good." The fire popped. Outside the common room windows the grey morning was beginning to give way, reluctantly, to something that might become afternoon, and the castle stirred around them with the ordinary sounds of a Saturday, students in corridors, distant laughter, peeves somewhere being objectionable, and underneath all of it the deep, patient hum of Hogwarts foundational magic, ancient and layered and present, the way things were present when they had been there for a very long time and planned to keep being. Harry looked at the 3 of them, Hermione already reaching for parchment, Ron finishing the mental process of being angry and emerging from it ready to act, Neville sitting with the hardened quiet of someone who had finally found a thing worth being ready for. He thought, 4 people who chose the room. "All right," he said. "Let's go find McGonagall." Chapter 6, 40 Curses Gone. McGonagall read the contents of Isolde's envelope in her office with the door closed, and Harry, Hermione, Ron, and Neville arranged in the chairs in front of her desk in the particular silence of people who have delivered something significant and are now waiting to see what it does. She read everything twice. The documents, the witness testimony, the vial of memory which she held up to the light and looked at without yet opening. Her face during all of this was the face Harry had seen in Transfiguration, the face of precision doing a great deal of work, containing a great deal of pressure. The professional surface was there. Underneath it, very clearly, something was building. When she set the last document down she sat very still for a moment. "Pettigrew," she said. "Alive," Harry said. "According to Vane, and the witness testimony supports it." "And Sirius," she stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked at a point on her desk and was silent for a count of 5. Then she looked up. "How long have you had this?" "Since this morning." She looked at him steadily. "You came to me directly?" "Yes." "Not the headmaster?" "Not yet," Harry said. "I wanted this in your hands first. You can decide how to handle it with him." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with an expression that contained several things layered together, the complicated guilt he'd seen from her since September 1st, and underneath it something that was older and more personal and had, Harry suspected, Sirius Black's name on it. "I knew him," she said. "Sirius. He was one of the best students I ever taught." She paused. "I believed he'd done it. For 10 years I believed," she stopped again. "You had no reason not to," Harry said. "The evidence was constructed to be believed." She looked at the vial of memory. "I'll need to view this in a pensieve. I'll need to contact, there are people in the ministry who owe me significant favors and who are not affiliated with the factions you've described." She straightened. "This will take time to move correctly. Sirius has survived 10 years in Azkaban. He can survive the time it takes to build an airtight case." "I know," Harry said. "The architects," she said. "Yaxley. Are you in immediate danger?" "They're aware of me," Harry said. "They're not ready to move yet. They want the fracture accessible, which means they want me alive and unaware for as long as possible. They don't know I know about them. And Malfoy's constructs. I have a plan for those," Harry said. McGonagall looked at him with the expression she'd been developing over the past month, the expression of someone who kept encountering a person operating at a level they hadn't prepared for and was revising their frame of reference on an ongoing basis. "Do I want to know the details?" "Probably not yet," Harry said. "When it happens, it'll be visible." "Visible," she repeated. "Malfoy will feel it when the constructs are destroyed. He'll react. I'd like you to be watching when he does." She held his gaze. Then she said, "I will make myself available." A pause. "Harry. The fracture. The room's process." Her voice shifted slightly, into something more personal than professional. "Are you certain?" "No," Harry said honestly. "But I trust the information and I trust the methodology and I trust the people helping me work through it." He paused. "And it's my core. It's my fracture. It should be my choice." McGonagall looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the conclusive quality of someone who has decided something fully. "Yes," she said. "It should." They stood to go. At the door, Ron paused and turned back. "Professor. Did Dumbledore know? About Sirius, about Pettigrew, at the time, did he know Black was innocent?" McGonagall was quiet for a moment that was half a second too long. "That," she said carefully, "is a question I intend to ask him directly. Very soon. And very clearly." Ron looked at her. "Right," he said, and they left. The week between that Saturday and the following Friday was the most productive week Harry had spent in his life, which was saying something given the standard he'd set since arriving at Hogwarts. Isolde's documents had been in the library gap Sunday morning, as promised, 12 pages of close-written notes on the room's process, the fracture mechanics, the basin medium, and the specific sequence for safe, staged curse removal. Hermione took them to the common room and read them through once and then spent 2 hours cross-referencing against her rune translation notes and emerged with the expression of someone whose theory had been confirmed by data. "The medium is a specific solution," she said, "that Hogwarts already has. There's a well in the room itself. I found the covering stone last week but didn't know what it was for. The well feeds directly into the basin. It's connected to the same foundational water source that runs through the original building." "You found a well," Ron said. "Under the basin platform. The stone covering has the same proto-runic markings as the walls." She pulled out her translation notes and pointed. "This phrase, which I've been translating as clarity medium, it's not a reference to an external substance. It's a reference to what the well contains. The foundational water is the medium. It's been running through proto-runic arrays for over 1,000 years. The magical saturation level is extraordinary. It's been ready the whole time," Harry said. "Since before Hogwarts was built," Hermione said. "Yes." They went down to the room that evening, all 4 of them. Harry pulled the covering stone from the base of the basin platform, and below it was the well, a narrow shaft, dark and cool, and when Harry held his hand over it he could feel the magic rising from it like warmth from a radiator. Old and clear and perfectly attuned to the work the room was built to do. "We lift the basin onto the platform," Hermione said, reading from Isolde's notes. "The basin sits on the well mouth. The water rises by itself, the array drives it. The medium self-fills to the correct depth." She looked up. "Then you stand in the basin." "In the water," Harry said. "The water comes up to your knees," she said. "The disc reads your signature through the medium. The curses precipitate out," Isolde describes it as, "they become visible in the medium as dark structures. Physical form. Breakable." "How does breaking them feel?" Ron said. Hermione consulted the notes. "She says, uncomfortable. Not painful, exactly. More like removing something that's been in a wound so long the skin has grown over it. The feeling of a thing that's been part of you separating." She looked at Harry. "The fracture repair is different. She says it feels like," she paused, reading, "setting a bone. The structural correction. She says it hurts but it's clean. The kind of hurt that's doing something." "Right," Harry said. "She also says the first session should only address the outer curses. The Ministry ones and the Azkaban ones. Save the deep embedded work for later sessions when you know what the process feels like." Hermione looked at him. "She's being careful with you." "I know," Harry said. And the specific quality of that knowledge, the complexity of it, a woman who had wronged him being genuinely careful with him, sat in the room without needing to be resolved. "When?" Neville said. Harry looked at the room. At the disc rotating above the empty basin. At the ancient walls with their patient runes. At his three friends arranged around the space with the readiness of people who had decided to be present for something and meant it completely. "Friday evening," he said. "After dinner. When the library is closed and the corridor is empty. I'll get the basin into position Thursday night," Hermione said, already making notes. "I'll make sure we're not interrupted," Ron said. Which coming from Ron meant he'd handle the social logistics, the cover story, the awareness of where Filch was likely to be, the casual mention in Gryffindor common room that Harry had an early night, with the easy social fluency that was his specific kind of competence and that Harry relied on more than he sometimes said. Neville said nothing. He just nodded, the small solid nod of someone who is fully in. Thursday brought Draco Malfoy. Not because Harry had orchestrated it, exactly. He'd been thinking about the conversation since Saturday, turning the approach over in his mind, and he'd landed on a version that was honest without being tactical, which was harder to construct than the tactical version and more likely to produce a real result. He'd been waiting for the right moment. The moment arrived in the corridor outside Charms when Draco appeared at his elbow with the studied casualness of someone who had been waiting for a corridor moment and moved when they saw it. "Potter," Draco said. "Malfoy," Harry said. They fell into step together, which surprised Draco slightly. He'd clearly prepared for Harry to keep walking. Crabbe and Goyle were several feet behind, which told Harry Draco had engineered this with at least minimal forethought. "Your father's visit," Harry said. Draco's expression went carefully neutral. "What about it?" "He came to see Dumbledore about student records," Harry said. "He specifically wanted information about me. Dumbledore refused him. He said it factually, not cruelly, because the cruelty would be in the fact itself and Harry wasn't interested in adding to it." "You already know that." Draco's jaw tightened slightly. "My father has legitimate, I know what he has," Harry said. "I'm not interested in arguing about your father." He paused. "I'm interested in talking to you." Draco stopped walking. Harry stopped too and turned to face him. Crabbe and Goyle had fallen further back. They understood, at some level, that they weren't needed for this particular conversation and had the specific animal social intelligence to act on that understanding. Draco looked at Harry with the complicated expression he'd been carrying all term, the wanting to impress and the wanting to be on the right side, and underneath both of those, something more personal that Harry was only now reading clearly. Draco Malfoy was a boy who had been told his entire life exactly who he was and what he was for, and he had arrived at Hogwarts and met Harry Potter in a corridor and found that the story he'd been given didn't match the person in front of him, and that gap was making him uncomfortable in ways he hadn't yet learned to process. "Your father has 3 carved stone boxes at the manor," Harry said. "One of them, the one on his desk in his study, has a false base containing objects he built to track my magic." Draco's face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, then the reflexive defense of someone whose instinct was to protect his family, and then, smaller, harder to see, something that was not surprise at all. He'd known. Not the specifics. But he'd known there was something. "I'm not going to have your father arrested," Harry said. "Not for this, not right now. I'm working through things in the right order." He looked at Draco steadily. "I'm telling you because you have a right to know that your father has been using you as a surveillance asset since September. The watching, the reporting back, the careful positioning, you've been doing it because he asked you to. I want you to be doing things because you've chosen to." Draco stared at him. The expression had settled into something Harry hadn't seen on it before, stripped of the practiced disdain, stripped of the performance, just a 12-year-old boy standing in a corridor having a conversation that had moved past anything he'd prepared for. "Why are you telling me this?" Draco said. "Because I'm not going to use you without your knowledge," Harry said. "And because at some point you're going to have to decide what you are separate from what your father needs you to be, and that decision will be easier if you've had honest conversations before it becomes urgent." He paused. "That's it. That's the whole reason." Draco was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're strange, Potter." "I know," Harry said. "You could have just," Draco stopped. "Started again. Most people would use this." "Yes," Harry said. "Why don't you?" "I told you. I'm not continuing a pattern I object to." He held Draco's gaze. "Think about what I've said. You don't owe me anything for it. But think about it." He walked away. He didn't look back. He heard Draco standing in the corridor behind him for a long moment before finally moving, and the quality of that stillness, a person genuinely sitting with something real, was, Harry thought, the most honest thing Draco Malfoy had probably done all term. Friday evening. The library closed at 8. By 8:15 the corridor outside it was empty. By 8:20 Harry, Hermione, Ron, and Neville were in the room beneath the oldest shelves, and the basin was sitting on the platform above the well, and Hermione had already confirmed the medium was rising, a slow, clear, faintly luminous water that smelled like cold stone and something else, something resinous and alive, the same quality Harry had smelled the first time he came down here. The disc above the basin was rotating at the same pace as always. Patient. Unhurried. It had been doing this for a very long time. Harry stood at the edge of the platform. "First session," Hermione said, with the focused calm of someone who had prepared for this extensively and was deploying that preparation now. "Ministry curses and the Azkaban-attributed ones. 12 total. The process will read them and precipitate them out of your signature into the medium." She paused. "I'll be reading the array responses as you go. If anything doesn't look right I'll tell you." "Ron," Harry said. "Here," Ron said, which was all he said, but the quality of it was full. "Neville." "Here," Neville said. Harry took off his shoes and stepped into the basin. The medium was cold, then immediately not cold, it adjusted, or his skin adjusted, or the magic in it adjusted, and the feeling of it against his feet and ankles was like stepping into something that was paying attention to him. The disc above shifted its light and he felt it reading him the way it had read him before, except now with the medium as a conductor the reading was deeper and clearer and more like being known than being assessed. He let his magic run loose the way he'd done before, and this time he pushed it downward, into the medium, through it, the way you'd push your hand through water to stir it. He felt the resistance of it, the particular resistance of a substance that was magically saturated and had its own momentum, and he pushed through anyway with the steady patience of someone who had spent 11 years being patient about the most fundamental things. The medium changed. Not its appearance, it was still clear and luminous, but its texture, the way it pressed back against his magic, became something more organized. He felt the array engaging, the wall runes running current through the basin system, the disk narrowing its light. And then the curses started to precipitate. He felt them separating from his magical signature the way Hermione had described, not like cutting, more like dissolving. The ministry curses were the outermost, the most recently placed, and they came first. He felt each one as a distinct loosening, a small release, and in the medium around his feet he could see them forming, dark filaments, thin as thread, coiling in the water like smoke made solid. 12 of them. They drifted to the surface and spread out, and he could see the structure of them clearly for the first time, the construction architecture he'd been mapping from the inside for years now visible from the outside. "I can see them," Hermione breathed. "Me too," Ron said. "How do they break?" Harry said. His voice was steady. He was concentrating, holding his magic running through the medium while the precipitation continued. "Your intent," Hermione said, reading from Isolde's notes. "You formed them through your signature involuntarily. You dissolve them by choosing to. She says think of it as, withdrawing consent." Harry looked at the dark filaments floating in the luminous water. He thought about 12 years of being monitored without permission, of data about his development flowing outward to a ministry faction that considered him a strategic asset rather than a person. He thought about withdrawing consent with the specific, deliberate force of someone who has never had the option before and intends to use it fully. The filaments came apart. Not dramatically. They simply dissolved, thread by thread, the structure unwinding until there was nothing left in the medium but a faint dark dispersal that faded as he watched. 12 curses. Gone. He felt the space they'd occupied, small spaces, peripheral in his magical signature, but spaces nonetheless, places that had been filled since before he could remember and were now clean. Clean was the right word. It felt like an open window in a room that had been shut for years. 12, Hermione said. "Harry, that's 12. "I know," he said. "Are you all right?" He checked. He was tired. The sustained magical effort of running his signature through the medium was real work, not effortless, but functional. "Clear." "Yes," he said. "Let's do the Azkaban ones." "Harry," Ron started. "I'm fine," Harry said. "The notes say the first session runs until it runs. I'll stop when I need to stop." He pushed his magic back through the medium and felt for the next layer, the Azkaban Death Eater curses, older and slightly coarser in construction than the ministry ones, placed in the chaos of the first weeks after Godric's Hollow by people who had since been imprisoned and whose curses were running on fading residual intent. They came away more easily than the ministry ones, almost as though they'd been waiting for permission, and he felt them precipitate out one by one into the medium with the small clean releases of removing things that were already half gone. The medium darkened further as the structures formed and then lightened again as he withdrew consent and they dissolved. 6 curses. Then 7. Then the last 2 together, loosening simultaneously as though they'd been tied. 25 curses gone. 12 remaining. He stood in the medium with his magic running through the basin array and felt the difference. Not dramatically transformed. Not suddenly powerful or vast or different in kind. Just, less burdened. The way a person who has been carrying something heavy for so long they've forgotten what their body felt like without it might feel when the weight is finally set down. 25, Hermione said quietly. Her voice was doing something careful. 25, Harry confirmed. He looked up at the disk. It was rotating with the same patience as always and its light was warm and it had done exactly what it was built to do with the same unhurried competence of something that had been built for one purpose and cared about it deeply. He stepped out of the basin. The medium receded as he stepped off the platform, draining back down through the well mount with the quiet inevitability of water finding its level. His feet were dry the moment they touched the floor. The medium left nothing on him. Hermione was beside him before he'd fully processed being upright, not fussing. She didn't fuss, she checked, which was different. She looked at his face and checked his eyes and said, 12 remaining. Malfoy's 7 and the 5 deep ones, Harry said. Not tonight, she said firmly. No, he agreed. Not tonight. He looked at her. The deep ones need to wait until the constructs are destroyed. Removing them without taking out the anchors first would be like pulling stitches from a wound that's still open. Next session will be Malfoy's 7, she said. After the constructs are gone. Yes. Which requires, I know, Harry said. He looked at his hands. The 25 curses gone had left something in their absence that he was still mapping, not emptiness, the opposite of that. Space that was his. His signature, unencumbered in 2/3 of its surface for the first time in his life. Neville said, quietly, from the far side of the room, how do you feel? Harry considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He felt the disk above the empty basin. He felt the runes in the walls, patient and ancient. He felt the castle above them and Hogwarts' foundational magic pressing warmly against his skin and his own magic running clean and unobstructed through 25 fewer obstacles than it had this morning. Like myself, he said. More than I have before. Ron made a short sound that was trying not to be emotional and failing at it slightly, and then covered by saying, right, well, we should get back before curfew, which was practical and therefore forgivable. They went back up. The following Wednesday Harry was in potions. Snape was demonstrating a preparation technique at the front of the class, the particular fluid precision of someone for whom potion making had become so physically instinctive that the body did it while the mind watched from a slight distance, and Harry watched him work and thought about the conversation he'd been building since Saturday. He waited until the end of class. Let everyone file out. Told Hermione with a glance that he was staying, and she went without asking, which was the specific trust of someone who had learned when to step back. Snape was cleaning down the demonstration bench. He knew Harry was still there. Harry had seen him register at the moment the room started emptying, but he didn't turn around until the class was fully gone and the door had closed and the dungeon held only the two of them and the smell of whatever they'd been working on that afternoon. He turned. His expression was what it always was, controlled, black-eyed, giving nothing. Mr. Potter, he said. Did you require assistance with today's preparation? No, Harry said. I wanted to talk to you. A pause. Office hours are Thursday, this isn't about coursework, Harry said. He stood at his workbench and looked at Snape directly and thought about 25 curses dissolved in luminous water and the space that their absence left, and he said, I know about the monitoring construct you placed in 1981. In the rubble of Godric's Hollow, before the Ministry arrived. The one that's still active in my magical signature. The potions classroom was completely silent. Snape's face, which was never an easy thing to read, went through something very small and very contained. It took about 2 seconds and involved nothing so obvious as expression, more like a shift in the architecture behind his expression, a load-bearing wall moving slightly under pressure. I also know, Harry said, keeping his voice level and his eyes on Snape's face, that you were my mother's friend. Before everything else. Before Hogwarts was complicated and before the war was stupid and before everything went wrong. I know you tried to warn Dumbledore. I know the warning came too late. Snape said nothing. His hands were still on the edge of the demonstration bench and they were very still. I'm not angry at you, Harry said. It's complicated. But I'm not angry. He paused. I wanted you to know that I know, and that I'm going to remove the construct when the time comes. Through the room under the library. On my terms. He paused again. And I wanted to ask you something. What? Snape said. His voice was carefully controlled. It was doing a significant amount of work. Did she know? Harry said. My mother. Did she know did she know how you felt about her, at the end? Before Godric's Hollow. The silence stretched. Snape looked at Harry for a long moment, and Harry looked back without flinching or looking away, and without demanding, just asking, just being in the room honestly and letting the question be as large as it was. Yes, Snape said. His voice was different, flatter, stripped of its professional tone, the voice of someone speaking from a place they didn't usually let anyone see. She knew. Good, Harry said simply. Another silence. Snape looked at him, really looked at him, the drilling focus Harry had noticed in every class amplified, the searching for something quality now fully visible. You look like your father, Snape said. But you are, he stopped. Her. Harry offered. Snape's jaw worked. In some respects, he said. Harry nodded. He picked up his bag. At the door he paused. She must have been remarkable, he said. For someone like you to have mourned her this carefully for this long. He left before Snape could respond to that, because some things deserved to be the last word, and he walked up from the dungeons into the ordinary afternoon light of a Hogwarts corridor and let the conversation settle in him, and found that it felt right. Not resolved, that would take much longer, if it happened at all, but honest. Two people in a room choosing to be honest with each other about a hard thing. He was getting better at those conversations. The Draco situation resolved itself on Thursday morning at breakfast. Draco appeared at the Gryffindor table, an act so socially unprecedented that the surrounding students went quiet in a spreading circle of surprise, and stood next to Harry's seat with his hands in his pockets and his chin at the angle Harry had identified as Draco's specific expression for when he was about to do something that cost him something and had decided it was worth it. The box you mentioned, Draco said. The one on my father's desk. Harry looked up at him. Yes. I go home for a long weekend at the end of this month. My mother likes me to come back before the full Christmas holidays, she says the house is too quiet. He said this with the specific flatness of someone delivering facts they don't want to embroider. I can take things out of my father's study. He doesn't lock it when I'm home. Harry held his gaze. Draco. You understand what taking that box would mean. Your father would know. There would be consequences for you. I know, Draco said. This isn't something you should do for me, Harry said. I meant what I said, this is your choice, not mine. Draco looked at him with the expression that had come out in the corridor, the stripped-back version, the one without the practiced disdain. I'm not doing it for you, he said. I'm doing it because the box is an object in my house that was built to invade someone else's privacy, and my father put it there and I don't want it there. A pause. And because at some point, he stopped, started again, at some point I have to start making choices instead of having them made for me. Harry looked at him for a long moment. The box needs to be physically destroyed, he said. Not hidden. Destroyed. I can do that. It needs to happen before you come back to school. If you have it on you when you return, I won't have it on me, Draco said. I'll destroy it there. At the manor. Then come back. Your father will feel it when you do, Harry said. The feedback from the constructs. He'll know what happened. I know, Draco said. And? Draco looked at him with the specific steady look of someone who has decided something they've been building toward for weeks. And that will be a conversation I have with my father. That's between me and him. He paused. Not you. Agreed, Harry said. Completely. Ron, beside Harry, was staring at Draco with the expression of someone whose world map had just acquired a new country in an unexpected location. Hermione was watching the exchange with the focused attention of someone cataloging data. Neville was looking at Draco with something that was not warmth and not coldness, but was the specific neutrality of someone who was watching a person make a choice and reserving judgment for how they follow through. All right, Harry said. Draco nodded once. He turned and walked back to the Slytherin table, and his back was very straight, and Crabbe and Goyle looked confused, which was probably their default state but more visible than usual. "Did that just happen?" Ron said. "Yes," Harry said, and ate his toast. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening at dinner, Harry felt it. He was sitting at the Gryffindor table with Ron to his left and Hermione to his right and Neville across from him, and they were having an argument about whether the charms essay question had implied a minimum of 12 inches or simply recommended it, and mid-sentence Harry felt the 3 anchoring constructs at Malfoy Manor cease to exist. Not gradually. All at once. The 7 deep-embedded Malfoy curses, which had been sitting in his signature at their usual depth and frequency, lurched, the way a sound lurches when its source is cut, and began degrading. Not instantly, not completely, but the structural integrity of the deep embedding was compromised without its anchors, and he could feel the 7 curses beginning to come apart from the inside. "It happened," Harry said. Hermione went still. Ron put down his fork. Neville looked up. "Draco destroyed them," Harry said. The degrading was slower than he'd expected, deep embedding didn't collapse cleanly, it unraveled, and he could feel the 7 curses loosening gradually like stitching coming out of cloth. Over the next 10 minutes, sitting at dinner in the Great Hall, he felt them come apart thread by thread while the conversation around him continued and the candles floated overhead and the ceiling showed an evening sky going dark at the edges. At the staff table, he watched Snape go very still in the specific way of someone who had felt something significant happen at a distance. Snape's eyes found Harry across the hall and held for a moment, and Harry gave the smallest nod, and Snape looked away. At the Slytherin table, Draco came in at 8:15, later than usual, his traveling robe still on. He sat down. He served himself something without looking at the food. His face was the face of someone who has had a significant conversation with their father and come through it and is still in the process of working out what that means. His chin was at the angle it went when something had cost him something and he'd paid it anyway. He looked up and met Harry's eyes across the hall. Harry held the look for a moment. Then he turned back to his dinner. Hermione touched his arm. "The 7 are degrading," she said quietly. "Yes. Tonight." "The room," she said. "After dinner," he said. She nodded. They ate. The great hall moved around them in its ordinary evening way, the noise and warmth of 1,000 people at the end of a Tuesday, the mail owl that arrived late with a parcel for someone at the Hufflepuff table, Peeves drifting through the upper air near the enchanted ceiling making faces at the first years. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. The kind of ordinary that Harry had lived inside for weeks now and still found remarkable because he had not, prior to September, ever lived inside any kind of ordinary. After dinner, they went to the room. The medium rose in the basin with the same quiet inevitability as before, clear and luminous, and Harry stood in it and felt the 7 degrading Malfoy curses and knew that this session was going to be different from the first because the curses were already unstable and the precipitation would be faster and less controlled and he was going to need to move quickly. He pushed his magic through the medium and the array engaged and the curses came apart almost immediately, faster than before, the degraded structure not resisting the way intact curses would resist, and in the medium around his feet the dark filaments appeared and dissolved almost in the same motion. He felt each one go with a clarity that the first session hadn't had, the deep Malfoy curses had been there since he was an infant, woven into layers of him that he'd never had access to, and their removal was not painless. Not exactly. More like the ache of stretched muscles after long use, a feeling that was in the family of pain but doing something productive. 7. He counted them. 7 dark structures forming in the luminous water and 7 times his intent withdrew and 7 times the filaments dissolved. He stood in the empty medium for a moment. 18 curses gone tonight. 25 before. 43 total. Wait. He stopped. Counted again. He'd started with 40. 3 order curses removed by Dumbledore in September. 25 in the first session. 7 tonight. That was 35. 5 remaining. The 5 deep ones. Harry, Hermione said. She had seen it in his face. Not tonight. The Malfoy curses are gone, he said. The fracture requires the full process, she said. Not tonight. You've done 25 plus 7 in 3 weeks. The fracture repair takes a full session by itself and you need to come to it rested and clear. She was right. He knew she was right. He'd read Isolde's notes on the fracture repair enough times that he could recite them, and the notes were consistent. The fracture required sustained focused magical effort over an extended period, and attempting it on the back of other removal work was inadvisable. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she agreed. He stepped out of the basin. Saturday morning. The castle still, the east courtyard empty, the library not yet open. All 4 of them came down. Hermione had the notes, had the translation, had everything she'd been building toward since the first night in the room organized into a sequence that she walked Harry through once, calmly and completely. The 5 deep curses. 2 Isoldes. 1 Pettigrew's. 1 Snape's. 1 from the Voldemort fragment. And beneath all of them, the fracture. The fracture repair will happen last, Hermione said. After the 5 curses precipitate. The array will address it automatically once the curses are cleared. Isolde says you won't need to do anything specific for it except not resist. The array will do the structural work. Your job is to let it. Not resist, Harry said. It will feel like something is closing that has been open. Your instinct might be to feel that as a threat. She met his eyes. It isn't. I know, he said. He stepped into the medium. The deep curses were different from the others. He'd known they would be, but the reality of it was more significant than the anticipation. They were woven into the foundational layer of his magical core, and the disc's reading of him through the medium this morning was slower, more careful, more like surgery than like dissolution. He felt the array working with a precision that the earlier sessions hadn't required, fine and exact, reading the architecture of his core at the deepest level and beginning the very careful work of differentiating what was him from what was not. He stood in the medium for a long time. Isolde's 2 constructs came first. He felt them in a way that was different from the Ministry curses or the Malfoy ones. These had been in him since the night of Godric's Hollow. They had been woven into the earliest layers of his magical development, and their removal was thorough and slow and carried a weight that was difficult to describe. Not grief, exactly. More like acknowledging something for the first time that had always been present and would now be past. He withdrew consent. 2 dark structures formed in the luminous medium and dissolved. Pettigrew's construct. He stood with the knowledge of what it was and who had placed it for a moment before withdrawing consent. A man who had betrayed his parents. A man who had watched Harry survive 10 years from hiding with the particular misery of someone who knows exactly what they've done. He felt the curse come free with a clean, sharp sensation that was nothing like the others. Snape's construct. He held it for a moment too, 2 people in a dungeon, an honest conversation, she knew. He withdrew consent. The construct dissolved in the medium and he thought, that's one more thing between us that doesn't need to be there. The last one. He felt it and recognized it in a way that was nothing like intellectual recognition. The Voldemort fragment's curse was the deepest and the oldest, and it had been laid in him before he could breathe on his own, laid by something that had been dying as it placed it, a last desperate act of a fractured consciousness clinging to the world through the body of the child it had tried to kill. It had been in him for 11 years. It had been there before he had memories. He looked at it in the medium's light. Dark and intricate and old. He withdrew consent with the full weight of everything he was. It dissolved. And then the array shifted. He felt it, the disk above the basin rotating and then slowing, and then the light it cast changed completely, warming from amber to something that was almost gold, and the medium around his feet began to run with a current he hadn't felt in the previous sessions, moving upward, and the rune arrays on all the walls came alive simultaneously in a way they hadn't before, all of them, the original proto-runic construction and Slytherin's annotations and every carved sequence that Hermione had spent weeks translating. The fracture. He felt the array find it, the place in his core that had been forced open on the night of October 31st, 1981, the door that had been broken and never fully closed, the wound that Dumbledore had built plans around and that the architects had wanted to exploit and that Isolde had spent 11 years researching and that Harry had felt as a discontinuity in his own magic for as long as he'd been feeling his own magic. The array began the repair. It hurt. He'd been told it would hurt and it did, in the clean specific way of structural work, not the pain of damage but the pain of correction, bone setting, something being put back into its proper position. He stood in it and held himself steady and thought about what Hermione had said, don't resist. Let it. He let it. The repair took 40 minutes. He knew because Hermione told him afterward, from inside he had no sense of time, just the sustained effort of letting the array do what it was doing and not flinching away from the feeling of his own core being made whole. At some point the pain peaked and then began receding, and he felt the fracture close the way a held breath is finally released, not lost, not gone, but resolved. A door set back in its frame and latched properly. His own magic, on the other side of it, felt like a room he'd never been in before. Not more powerful. Not transformed in kind. Just, complete. Unencumbered. Running clean from the deepest layer to the surface without a single obstacle that hadn't been put there by him. He was aware of the three of them before he opened his eyes. He could feel them, not magically, just as presences, the way you feel people who are paying close attention to you from a short distance. Hermione to his right, Ron to his left, Neville directly ahead, and the room around them warm and amber-lit and patient as it had always been. He stepped out of the basin. 40, Hermione said. Her voice was doing the thing it did when she was containing something large. 40, Harry said. Ron said nothing for a moment. Then, all of them. All of them, Harry said. Neville was very still. How do you feel? Harry stood on the floor of the ancient room and took stock of himself with the same methodical attention he'd applied to everything else. His magic, running clean and full and completely his own for the first time in his life. His core, repaired, the fracture closed and healed and no longer available to anyone who might want to exploit it. The absence of 40 tracking curses that had been present in his magical signature since before he could walk. He felt the castle above him, Hogwarts' ancient magic pressing against his skin the way it always had, but cleaner now, the way you notice how clear water is when you're not looking through something murky. He felt the morning outside, Saturday and still, the lake and the grounds and the enormous sky. He felt, in the specific private way of someone arriving somewhere after a long journey and recognizing the place, himself. Good, he said. I feel good. Hermione made a sound. It was very brief and she covered it immediately by looking at her notes and saying something about documenting the session, and Harry let her, because some things deserved the covering and this was one of them. Ron punched his shoulder once, lightly, with the specific economy of someone who has a great deal to say and has decided one punch covers most of it. Neville looked at him from across the basin with an expression that was nothing like the expression of the round-faced boy who'd fallen off a stool on sorting night. There was something in it that was older than 11 years and more solid than anything Harry had seen in a person his age, the expression of someone who has watched a thing happen that mattered to him deeply and feels the mattering settle in him like weather changing. What now? Neville said. Harry looked up at the disk, which had slowed to its ordinary pace and returned to its warm amber light and was rotating with the patient unconcern of something that had done its work and was content to keep doing it for another 1,000 years. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban, and the evidence in McGonagall's hands, and the wheels of that process beginning to turn. He thought about Pettigrew alive somewhere and Yaxley in the Ministry and the architects who had just lost their primary interest in Harry Potter. He thought about Snape in the potions dungeon with his hand still on the demonstration bench and 10 years of complicated feeling that had just had one of its threads quietly removed. He thought about Draco Malfoy coming back from a long weekend with his chin at that angle. He thought about the restricted section pass in his robes and the library above them and the 5 months of school still ahead and everything he was going to learn in them. He thought about 40 tracking curses, removed. He thought about a fractured core, healed. He thought about the specific, irrevocable fact of standing in the room beneath the oldest part of Hogwarts on a Saturday morning in October 1991 and belonging entirely to himself for the first time. "Now," Harry said, and there was something in his voice that was nothing like 11 years old and nothing like the boy who'd grown up in a cupboard under the stairs and exactly like the person he was going to be from this point forward, "we do the rest of it." He picked up his shoes. He started up the stairs. Behind him, the disc rotated. The room held its warmth. The ancient water receded back down the well, clear and luminous, having done what it was built to do. Above them, Hogwarts waited, its 1,000 rooms and moving staircases, its 5 months of the year still to run, its corridors full of the particular magic of a place that had been thinking for a very long time and had, over the course of a single October, decided it was glad of the company. Harry pushed open the library door and walked out into the morning.